Hey there. Before we begin, take a breath. Let the room around you dim a little, or if you prefer, close your eyes and let your imagination do the lighting. Tonight's story is one of clanking, armor-tired horses and men who regretted almost every decision that brought them to the muddy field they were about to die in. It's a story of knights. Not the polished movie-ready knights who always seem to win the day, but the real ones, the sweaty, blistered, perpetually sore humans who discovered that swinging metal at other people was far less glamorous than poets later claimed. Now, if you're ready, settle in. Maybe you've had a long day. Maybe you're half asleep already, and that's fine. Because tonight, we'll stroll gently through the truth behind the legend, the life of a medieval knight, and the very inconvenient relationship he had with his favorite weapon, the sword. You've seen it in every film. A shining blade perfectly balanced, cutting through armor like butter, held aloft by a hero with perfect teeth and suspiciously clean hair. But history, as it tends to do, has a less flattering version. Let's begin there, in the middle of a field that smells like rain sweat and horse manure. The sun hasn't quite risen. You're a knight, though that title sounds grander than it feels. Your armor weighs as much as a large dog clinging to your every limb. Your stomach is somewhere between hungry and terrified, and the mud is winning the battle against your boots. The sword at your side feels reassuring, yes, but also slightly mocking, as if it knows something you don't. Because here's the secret: every real knight learned, sooner or later. If you're reaching for your sword, things have already gone very wrong. You see, swords weren't the first choice. They were the plan Z. Before a sword came into play, a knight would have tried his lance, then his spear, maybe his mace, perhaps even his shield. The sword was for the moment when all of that had failed, when your horse had galloped off. Without you, your spear had snapped, your shield lay somewhere under another man's horse, and you were standing there holding 3 pounds of steel, whispering an apology to your ancestors. But let's pause for a moment. There's something comforting about the myth, isn't there? The knight, tall and steady, blade flashing like moonlight, locked in graceful combat. A little choreography, a few sparks, and then victory. The truth, though, is that real sword fights looked less like ballet and more like 2 exhausted construction workers arguing with crowbars. Every clang was a bone-rattling jolt that numbed your arms. Every swing was a gamble against fatigue. The armor didn't help much. It didn't split politely under pressure or fall apart dramatically when struck. It just absorbed the hit. It was the medieval version of knocking on a door that would never, ever open. You'd hit it again anyway, because hope is stubborn, and maybe, just maybe this time, it would give in. It wouldn't. That's when desperation took over, and knights stopped aiming for the armor itself. They aimed for the places the armor couldn't quite cover: the armpits, the elbow gaps, the throat, slit the spot between the legs everyone pretends not to talk about. Medieval combat manuals, yes, those existed, are long, detailed lists of, here's where to stab a man if you'd like him to stop being alive. Grim bedtime reading, really, but useful. And then there was the art of half-swording. It sounds elegant, but it really just means grabbing your own sword by the blade and using it like a spear. No, you wouldn't slice your hand open immediately. Medieval swords weren't the razor-edged lightsabers fantasy novels pretend they were. They were sharp enough to hurt, but not sharp enough to sever your fingers when you grabbed them with a gauntleted hand. Knights did it all the time, because at close range, precision mattered more than power. Picture it, two armored men, panting mud-spattered, gripping their blades halfway down, trying to thread a point of steel into an armpit while someone's horse screams in the background. Not quite the grand duel from the movies, but much closer to the truth. And when they weren't half-swording, they were grappling wrestling in armor, slamming each other into the ground and trying not to suffocate in their own helmets. Knights wrestled more often than they fenced. They'd grab at joints, shove with shields, tackle twist, and pray that gravity chose a favorite. The romantic image of chivalry doesn't survive the mud very well. And yet, for all its grime and chaos, there was something remarkable about it. These men, these walking ovens of steel, were trained athletes. They could sprint, climb, even somersault in full plate. Hollywood tells us knights clanked like teapots. History tells us they danced like tanks. The real limitation wasn't weight, it was heat. Inside that helmet, it was less heroic warrior and more boiled human. Sweat pooled in boots. Breathing turned into a steamy ordeal. And still, they fought not out of glory, but out of duty, fear, and survival. Every knight carried an entire toolbox of death swords, maces, hammers, axes, daggers, and spears, because no single weapon worked every time. Armor evolved so weapons evolved faster. A sword might bounce harmlessly off plate armor, but a mace could crumple it like tinfoil. A spear could reach farther, but only until someone got too close. Then you dropped it and pulled out something shorter. If the fight turned into a muddy wrestling match, and it usually did, you reached for your dagger. If you were still alive after all that, you bought the nearest monk a drink and thanked whichever saint handled near-death experiences. What's oddly comforting is how human it all was. We imagine knights as paragons of virtue and discipline, but on the battlefield, they cursed, tripped, panicked, and sometimes won, purely because the other guy slipped first. Medieval battles weren't clean lines of shining armor. They were chaotic messes of screaming, crashing, and exhaustion. Dust and smoke filled the air. Helmets narrowed vision to a slit. People often couldn't tell who they were hitting until it was too late. You fought whoever was in front of you and hoped your friends recognized your shield pattern. Speaking of shields, they were the unsung heroes. Not elegant props, but portable walls. Heavy, ugly life-saving. Knights used them to bash, shove, and flatten opponents. A good shield bash could end a fight faster than any sword. Of course, they broke often, splintered by axes, burned by arrows, trampled by horses. But that was their purpose. Better the shield splintered than the man behind it. And still, through all of this, the sword somehow became the symbol of knighthood. It wasn't the most effective weapon, not by a long shot, but it looked good in art. It was easy to mythologize. A lance might win the battle, but a sword won the painting. Poets could write about a sword. They could name it, romanticize it, turn it into a relic. And so the symbol endured, long after the mud washed away the truth. If you met a knight in the 14th century, you wouldn't find a movie hero. You'd find a man whose muscles ached constantly, whose hands were scarred, whose armor smelled faintly of despair. He'd tell you, if you bought him an ale, that battle was less about honor and more about hoping your armor didn't pinch too tightly when you fell. He'd laugh when you asked about swordplay and say something like, "If I'm using my sword, I've already made several poor decisions. And yet for all the misery, there's a strange beauty in their world. The clang of steel, the flash of sun on polished mail, the thunder of hooves before a charge. It all had a rhythm, brutal but mesmerizing. It was a profession built on contradictions, violence and artistry, chaos and discipline, faith and fear. Knights lived, knowing every fight might be their last, and still they trained, prayed, and rode out again. So tonight, as you lie there listening, remember that under every shining suit of armor was just a person, sweating, swearing, and trying their best not to die. Remember that the sword was never magic. It was desperation shaped into metal. Remember that the battlefield wasn't a stage, but a storm. And maybe if you listen closely, you can almost hear it, the distant hum of armor, the dull thud of hooves on wet earth, the breath of men who wish they were anywhere else. You can smell the rain-soaked mud, the faint tang of iron, the smoke from campfires lingering like ghosts over the field. That's where our story begins, not in a shining castle or under a noble banner, but here in the cold, damp dawn, where knights waited for orders and wondered which part of them would ache the most by nightfall. The sword at your side feels heavier now, not because of its weight, but because of what it means. It's not glory. It's not power. It's survival. And before you drift away, before the story slips quietly into sleep, remember that history's heroes weren't gods in armor. They were people who had to believe that steel and courage might be enough to carry them through another day. So breathe slow. Let the echoes fade. The knights are waiting, their swords resting against their knees, their minds half lost between fear and faith. The wind moves through the grass like a whisper of prayers. Somewhere a horse stamps and snorts impatient. And above it all, the sun begins to rise, pale, uncertain, but faithful. Another day of battle is coming, and that is where we begin. It's strange, isn't it, how the mind prefers stories that shine instead of the ones that sweat. When we picture a knight, we don't see a man who stinks of horse and fear. We see a figure poised in sunlight, blade raised every edge, catching gold. The sword glows, and the battle pauses long enough for us to believe this moment means something noble. But that's not how it happened. The sword, for all its fame, was the last thing a knight ever wanted to touch in earnest. When the horns sounded across a battlefield, there was an order to the chaos, at least for a minute or two. First came the lances, long, sturdy, meant for the thunderous charge. Horses pounded the earth like a second heartbeat, the line of knights shining and terrible. The lance was hope itself, splintering in the first seconds of collision. If fortune favored you, your enemy fell before you ever saw his face. If not, you felt the jolt through your shoulder, the wood snapping and the horse screaming. Then the world shrank to noise and mud. Next came the spear, the everyman's weapon. It was simple, practical, patient, the friend you actually needed. You could stand at a distance, jabbing and parrying, keeping the world far enough away to breathe. But spears broke, too snapped under weight, or vanished in the press of men. And the shield, that loyal slab of wood and hide, which had taken the first kiss of every arrow and axe, would eventually split apart. Then came silence, or something like it, a hollow space in the chaos where a knight looked down at his empty hands and realized that everything that had protected him was gone. That was when the sword called his name. It didn't sing, not really. It rasped a tired whisper as it left the scabbard. It was a companion of last resort, not glory. The sword meant the fight was closer now, too close. The sword meant survival had become personal. Knights didn't slice the air the way movies tell you. They swung with desperation, the whole body moving as one exhausted engine. The armor squealed at the joints. The breath echoed against the visor. Every swing took strength a man couldn't afford, and every impact was met by the disappointing reality of physics armor wasn't soft. It was stubborn, a curved defiance of steel. To hit armor with a sword was to hit disappointment itself. The blade shuddered, bounced, slid away. The sound was neither clean nor sharp, just a dull metallic complaint that vibrated up the arm until the shoulder ached. It was like hitting a bell that refused to ring. Movies love to pretend that swords slice through plate armor as though knights were wrapped in foil. But plate laughed at edges. Mail shrugged them off. Even the thick gambeson that padded jacket beneath everything absorbed much of the shock. So instead of slashing, knights stabbed. They thrust. They hammered. They treated their swords less like razors and more like tools for breaking locks. There's a strange intimacy in that, the closeness of it. Once the sword was out, the distance between men collapsed. The knight could smell his opponent's breath through the slit of a visor. He could hear the grunt behind every swing. Fights turned into wrestling matches with extra steps. You didn't duel. You grappled with intent. The sword's job wasn't to carve, but to find that one tiny opening the armor hadn't quite sealed. Those openings were cruelly small. A slit under the chin, the seam of the armpit, the crook of the elbow, the gap behind the knee that was the true map of death in the Middle Ages. Each gap barely wide enough for a finger, yet wide enough for fate. The knight learned to look for those flickers of vulnerability the way a hunter tracks the twitch of prey. When he lunged, it wasn't elegant. It was desperate precision. There was a word for the method half-sorting. It meant holding the blade halfway down gauntlet, gripping the metal itself. To modern eyes, it looks absurd, almost suicidal. But the edges of medieval swords weren't razor thin. They were sharp enough to cut unarmored flesh, but not so sharp they'd sever their own user's hands. With armored gloves, a knight could safely hold the blade and guide it like a spear. Half-sorting transformed the weapon. It became a short, rigid pike for prying open weak points. You could hook a visor open with the crossguard, drive the point into the armpit seam, or lever your opponent to the ground using your sword as a lever of pure steel. Manuals from the time, yes, they existed, show knights doing exactly that, tripping, hooking, choking, and thrusting. It was not the art of gallant warriors. It was wrestling for men in portable coffins. The manuals called the technique murder strokes. Even the name had no illusions. A murder stroke meant flipping the sword, holding it by the blade, and striking with the heavy pommel or crossguard the way you'd hammer a nail that had ruined your day. It worked because the point wasn't grace. The point was blunt force trauma delivered with no poetry at all. Imagine two armored figures locked together, boots slipping in the mud. They push, twist, stumble, and slam. Each breath is a muffled groan. One tries to force his blade into the gap beneath the other's chin. The other catches it, grabs the edge, shoves it away. The sword clangs, bends, digs into the dirt, is yanked back with a grunt. Every move costs air. Every second eats away at strength. After a while, it isn't courage, that keeps them moving. It's habit. In that moment, the sword is no longer a weapon. It's an extension of will, dull, shaking human. The fight is no longer about chivalry or songs. It's about which man's knees buckle first. When you read of knights crossing swords, don't picture elegance. Picture a street fight with better costumes. The clash of blades was less ballet and more accident. The awkward noise of survival banging against itself. Sparks didn't fly. Bruises did. Swords got stuck in joints or lodged in bones. Sometimes they snapped outright, leaving only a stump of metal in the hand. And still, knights fought on. Because once the sword was out, there was nothing left to fall back on. Even the sword's weight betrayed the myth. 3 pounds doesn't sound like much until you've been swinging it for minutes that feel like hours. A knight's shoulders screamed from the strain. The sword, unyielding, didn't care. It had no sympathy. It was a cruel, perfect piece of design, efficient, balanced, but entirely indifferent to the flesh that wielded it. After the battle, when the mud cooled and the air turned heavy with the scent of blood and earth, the survivors looked at their swords the way farmers look at plows after a storm. The tool had done its job, but at a cost. The edges were chipped. The hilt was slippery with what had been inside someone else. No gleam remained, just dull metal that had bitten too deep into the world. And yet, in that weary moment, knights loved their swords most. Because the sword, for all its cruelty, had stayed when everything else had broken. The horse could run, the spear could splinter, the shield could crack, but the sword, faithful, stubborn, scarred, always returned to its scabbard. It was loyalty forged in heat and misery. That's why, centuries later, when we imagine knights, we don't picture spears or maces or axes. We picture the sword. The spear belonged to armies, the mace to priests, the axe to executioners. But the sword that was personal. A man's sword was his name made metal. There's something deeply human about that attachment. We've always wanted our tools to mean more than their purpose. The sword became a symbol of identity because men needed it to be. You can't make poetry out of a mace, but a sword. A sword can hold a soul. It can be named blessed, inherited. It can shine long after its edge has dulled. But that myth only survived because people who told the stories never had to use one. The poets wrote of bright steel and singing blades, but they had never heard what steel really sounds like: a grunt, a clang, a dull scrape of metal that doesn't want to move anymore. They hadn't smelled the blood or felt the shudder through their bones when armor refused to yield. They needed a cleaner version, and so the sword became one, a symbol, not a memory. Still, if you could ask one of those knights, maybe a tired soul sitting by a dying fire after a long day of almost dying himself, he'd tell you that no poem ever caught the truth. The sword wasn't glorious. It was exhausting. It was heavy. It was the sound of a man running out of options. But it was his. And in the end, that mattered. Because when everything else failed, when the horse fell, the spear broke, the shield was gone, and even courage began to fade, there was still the sword, cold, stubborn, waiting, not as a promise of victory, but as a whisper. You are not finished yet. And so the sword became not the first weapon of choice, but the last friend standing. Its edge wasn't for glory. It was for the moments when breath and strength were slipping away, and all that remained was the stubborn refusal to stop fighting. That is why the sword endures. not because it conquered battlefields, but because it refused to leave them. There comes a moment somewhere in the heart of every medieval battle when elegance dies a quiet, muddy death. It's the moment when a knight realizes his blade, that proud, shining symbol of nobility, has become about as useful as a spoon. The armor before him glints mockingly, every polished curve deflecting another hopeless swing. He can feel the shock of impact tremble through his bones. The sword bounces off the breastplate with a noise like striking an iron pot. Nothing happens. Not even a dent worth bragging about later at the tavern. And so faced with the stubborn truth that chivalry alone cannot pierce steel, the knight does something that looks absurd to modern eyes. He slides one gauntleted hand right up the middle of the blade and grabs it. Not the hilt, not the handle, the blade itself. This is half-swording the most unromantic, most practical, and somehow most honest technique ever to emerge from the medieval world. It was not born in poetry or ceremony, but in panic and ingenuity. You see, once knights realized that armor would laugh at traditional swordplay, they stopped trying to look impressive. They started trying to survive. Half-swording transformed the weapon completely. What had once been a slashing instrument, all sweeping arcs and theatrical gestures, suddenly became a short spear, a crowbar, and occasionally a lever for murder. By gripping the blade about halfway up, the knight shortened the weapon, shifting control from flourish to precision. The sword ceased to be an instrument of style and became an instrument of surgery. You might be wondering how he didn't slice his hand open the moment he touched it. That's one of those myths born from watching too many movies where blades gleam like mirrors and slice paper in midair. Medieval swords weren't razors. Their edges could cut unarmored flesh, yes, but they were not so sharp that a gauntlet couldn't grasp them. Knights wore thick gloves of leather, reinforced with mail or steel plates, essentially portable armor for the fingers. Those gloves were the difference between mastery and mutilation. A bare hand might risk injury. A gloved one turned the impossible into common practice. And so across the grim centuries of armored warfare, men learned to hold their swords, like this, one hand on the hilt, the other halfway up the blade, ready to aim for the tiny seams that armor could never quite cover. Medieval combat manuals, some beautifully illustrated in neat Gothic script, have preserved this technique for us. They're strange documents to read. Part instruction, part confession. Imagine flipping through pages of elegantly drawn knights, politely stabbing each other in armpits. The diagrams are both meticulous and depressing, each figure frozen mid-strike, their faces expressionless, their movements mathematical. Arrows indicate the line of attack. Captions explain where to thrust, twist, and finish. There's something chillingly calm about it, like reading the notes of a man who has decided that killing is just another craft. These manuals, Fechtbücher, as the Germans called them, weren't written for the faint of heart. They spoke in the language of anatomy and efficiency. Here, one might instruct the opponent raises his guard. You step in close. Grasp your blade thus. Drive the point into the gap beneath his arm. Push until the resistance ends. No romance, no honor, just geometry and inevitability. You can almost imagine the students, young squires, sons of nobility, sweating beneath their training armor, trying to memorize the diagrams, their instructors pacing like patient carpenters of death. Half-swording was about learning to ignore instinct, everything in the human brain screams against grabbing a blade or walking toward danger, but knights were trained to do both with calm precision. The battlefield was the cruel test of that training. Picture it, a cold dawn wet earth sucking at armored boots. Two knights meet in the churn of mud and panic. Their lances are gone, their shields splintered. They circle not with grace, but with the heavy, uneven rhythm of exhaustion. The first swings a desperate arc that clangs harmlessly against the other's shoulder. The second man doesn't answer in kind. He steps closer inside the range, where big moves die, and grips his blade halfway up. Suddenly, the sword becomes something else, a straight line of intent. He thrusts, guiding the point like a needle toward the armpit. The first man jerks aside, the thrust scrapes against the plates, sparks briefly, then finds the soft joint beneath the arm. A grunt, a twist, a collapse. No music, no heroism, just mud and silence. Half-swording wasn't taught for glory. It was taught because nothing else worked. It turned the chaos of armored combat into a grisly form of problem-solving. You weren't fighting a man anymore. You were solving a puzzle of steel sweat and breathing gaps. Each thrust was an answer to the question, where does he bleed? Knights learned to use every part of the sword for these answers. The crossguard, the little bar above the hilt, could catch a blade or hook under a visor to wrench it open. The pommel, that weighted knob at the sword's end, became a hammer for knocking helmets, sometimes literally ringing a man's bell. And the blade itself, gripped and guided like a surgeon's tool, found its way into the narrow places where metal met mortality. If the opponent fell to the ground, the sword turned again from spear to lever. A knight could pin his enemy by pressing the crossguard against the throat or use the tip to keep him still. Sometimes he didn't bother with the sword at all and reached for a dagger to finish the job through the same gaps he'd been aiming for all along. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't fair. But war never cared for choreography. To an onlooker, half-swording looked clumsy, even desperate. There was no sweeping rhythm, no cinematic duel. It was two armored men locked together in a tangle of motion and noise, each trying to make the other stop moving first. But to the knight inside that steel shell, it was focus incarnate. He wasn't thinking about how it looked. He was thinking about geometry, about leverage, about where pressure became pain. The manuals emphasize this mental shift from performance to precision. Half-swording was chess at sword's length. Every move had a counter, every angle a response. To lose concentration was to lose blood. And yet, even in its brutality, there was a strange beauty. The beauty of function, refined to its sharpest point. Half-swording made the sword honest again. Gone was the illusion of effortless killing. What remained was control awareness, craft. It was a reminder that a knight's greatest weapon wasn't his steel, but his ability to adapt. Those who practiced half-swording often described the sensation afterward, how the blade felt alive between their hands, how its vibration carried the pulse of battle. In a world of clanging chaos, there was something almost meditative about it. One hand held strength, the other held precision. Together, they formed a balance between chaos and control. The armor dictated everything. Against unarmored foes, the sword could dance, but against plate, it had to whisper. The edge became meaningless. The point became everything. The knight learned to stab, not swing, to drive, not slash. He learned that the quietest motion could be deadlier than the loudest. When you read accounts of battles like Agincourt or Towton, buried in the margins of the chronicler's words, you sometimes find hints of this technique. Descriptions of knights pressing in close, striking beneath the arm, thrusting under the visor. They don't call it half-swording, but it's there, hidden between the lines, the silent craft of desperation, practiced by men who had run out of options. Even the artwork of the time betrays its truth. Illuminated manuscripts show duelists gripping their blades midway, their poses strange utilitarian. There's no elegance, no drama, just concentration. They look more like craftsmen at work than warriors at play, and that's exactly what they were, artisans of violence solving practical problems in real time. Somewhere in the middle of this grim logic lies a kind of dark humor. Imagine explaining half-swording to someone who believes the knight's life was all pageantry and tournaments. Yes, you might say, sometimes we hold the sword by the blade and jab each other in the armpit until one of us stops breathing. The look on their face would tell you everything about how far myth has drifted from reality. But that's the thing about desperation. It doesn't ask for permission to look good. It just wants to work. Half-swording was efficiency stripped of ego. It was a quiet, brutal language of survival that said, I will find the weakness in you before you find the weakness in me. And that, in its own strange way, is more impressive than any shining duel. Because it required humility, the acceptance that all the Polish in the world couldn't overcome good engineering. It required a man to take his most prized possession, the symbol of his honor, and choke it into submission just to stay alive. That humility, that reluctant genius, is why half-swording still fascinates those who study medieval combat today. It is the proof that knights were not fools trapped in armor, but practical thinkers who adapted to their world's physics with elegance born from necessity. If you close your eyes now and listen, you might hear it, the metallic rasp of gauntlets sliding along a blade, the grunt of effort, the soft clink as steel finds the small gap it has been searching for. There is no music, no audience. Just two men, the earth beneath them, and the grim intimacy of precision. And when the sword does its work, when it pierces that hidden space between armor plates, the noise of the battlefield fades for a heartbeat. The weapon has become what it was always meant to be. Not a symbol, not an art, but a quiet answer to the chaos of war. Half-swording, for all its awkwardness, is the most honest expression of medieval combat there ever was. It admits what the rest of the age tried to deny, that beauty doesn't win battles and honor doesn't pierce steel. Only controlled patience and a steady hand on cold metal ever did. And so in the end, the knight's sword, held not by its hilt, but by its heart, becomes something paradoxically human, imperfect, improvisational, alive. It was never meant to be glamorous. It was meant to be precise. And in the long silence after the fighting stopped, when armor cooled and men exhaled what breath they had left, that precision was all that kept one story breathing while another went still. There comes a point in every era of warfare when subtlety simply gives up. The sword had failed to cut through. Progress spears could be splintered. Arrows could bounce like pebbles against the new miracle of armor. And then someone, probably after losing 3 expensive swords and his temper picked up a lump of metal on a stick and decided to let physics handle the rest. That was the birth of the mace, the most honest weapon of the Middle Ages. The mace made no promises about elegance. It didn't gleam. It didn't need sharpening. It didn't care about grace lineage or style. It cared about momentum, the kind that could rearrange a man's skeleton without asking the armor's permission. Where swords failed by glancing off curved plates, the mace succeeded by ignoring the whole concept of cutting altogether. Why slice when you could crush plate armor? That glittering innovation of the later Middle Ages was the pride of every noble. Forged and fitted like a second skin, it turned arrows aside and laughed at blades. But with every new defense comes a new offense, and the mace was that answer. It turned the knight's invulnerability into an illusion. One solid swing could cave in a helmet dent, a breastplate, or snap bones beneath metal that looked perfectly intact. The victim might not bleed right away, but something inside would have shifted, and not in a poetic way. It was the weapon of reality, brutal, simple, efficient. Holding a mace was an act of surrender to common sense. A sword needed training finesse and timing. A mace needed only the ability to swing and a small amount of frustration with the world. 30 seconds of instruction could make anyone dangerous. The mace democratized mayhem. A sword might glance off and make a noise. A mace landed and made silence. Knights carried them when they expected trouble. Not the dueling kind, but the kind of chaos where everyone was shouting, and you couldn't see more than a few feet through the mud. The mace didn't get stuck in armor or lose its edge on bone. It just kept doing its job, reducing the problem in front of you to something flatter. And what a job it did. Contemporary accounts describe the aftermath of battles where armored men seemingly untouched from the outside were found dead inside their metal shells. Their ribs shattered, their skulls split beneath pristine helmets. The armor had done its duty. It had kept the blood in. There was something terrifying about that. The sword at least gave you the courtesy of a wound. The mace left you wondering why your legs no longer worked. Its design was the very picture of efficiency. Early versions were little more than heavy clubs, wood-bound in iron bands. Later craftsmen improved the physics, a solid metal head, flanged or spiked, mounted on a short haft that could be wielded with one hand. The flanges weren't for decoration. They focused the force of impact onto narrow ridges, turning blunt trauma into punctured steel. Even a small indentation could crush the mail or bruise the flesh beneath so severely that armor became a cage instead of protection. To swing a mace was to understand gravity in its purest form. You didn't guide it. You let it fall, and it fell with purpose. The sound of a mace hitting home was not the ringing music of swordplay. It was a wet, hollow thud that made even veterans flinch. It didn't slice it, didn't spark it, simply ended things. And that, perhaps, was its greatest psychological weapon. The sword was for gentlemen. The mace was for when the conversation was over. When a knight drew his sword, there was still an unspoken agreement about form and skill. When he reached for a mace, everyone knew the time for manners had passed. The mace didn't duel, it decided. It was the medieval equivalent of a slam door, final, rude, and effective. Some chronicles describe maces as the weapon of wrath. There's poetry in that. The church even approved of them for clerics who fought in battle. Since the mace technically didn't shed blood, priests and bishops could take to the field with one in hand and claim their conscience remained clean. A neat theological loophole, though anyone hit by a bishop's mace might have argued the point in another life. There was no pretense of nobility here. The mace was pure function. It didn't require artistry or bloodlines, only a willingness to get close enough for gravity to finish the conversation. It was the weapon of the exhausted, the angry, and the practical. And yet, there was a grim sort of intelligence in it. For all its bluntness, the mace was a marvel of design. The balance of weight, the curve of the handle, the way its momentum transferred through armor, all of it obeyed a brutal mathematics. The man who wielded it could feel the weapon working with him, as if the mace itself wanted the fight over. The sword, for all its beauty, demanded obedience. The mace demanded only cooperation. You didn't train with it for years. You swung it once and understood everything. It was war's version of a simple truth: impact always wins. When you held a mace, you could sense its honesty. It didn't lie about what it could do. There was no ceremony, no promise of glory, just the clean, unadorned physics of destruction. You could feel it through your gloves, the way the weight gathered behind each movement, the promise of something irreversible in every arc. The men who used maces often described it as satisfying not morally, but mechanically. You didn't wonder if your strike had worked. You felt it work. The feedback was instant, the result unmistakable. And unlike a sword, it didn't demand maintenance. You didn't polish a mace. You didn't oil it or worry about nicks. You could drop it in the mud, leave it in the rain, and it would still wake up ready to commit another small act of medieval physics. It was the blue-collar worker of the knight's arsenal. Never glamorous, always reliable. The psychological shift it brought to battle was immense. A man facing a sword still believed he could outskill his opponent. Facing a mace, he realized skill was irrelevant. There was nothing elegant about an object that could cave in your rib cage through 3 layers of armor. The mace didn't ask questions. It simply arrived like a judgment. You could tell when a knight had chosen to carry one. His silhouette changed the sword, replaced by a stubby, brutal shape hanging from his belt, like a warning rather than a decoration. The sword said, "I am trained." The mace said, "I am tired of this." And yet, it was surprisingly democratic. Peasants could wield them. So could clerics, guards, mercenaries, anyone who could lift an iron ball and swing. It required no years of fencing lessons, no noble tutors, no expensive craftsmanship. It was the everyman's answer to an armored world that pretended to be invincible. A good mace could be made in an afternoon by a competent blacksmith, a short shaft, a lump of iron, maybe a few spikes for flavor. Compare that to the sword, which took weeks of careful heating, folding, tempering, and balance. The mace asked for none of that. It didn't need to be perfect. It just needed to be heavy. The difference was philosophical as much as practical. The sword was about control. The mace was about surrender to weight, to gravity, to inevitability. It was war stripped of ceremony. Even knights who loved their swords carried maces for bad days. The sword was their signature, but the mace was their insurance. You never knew when you'd meet a man whose armor was too good, whose shield was too thick, whose luck refused to die. The mace was the answer to all of that. You could see it in their eyes. When they reached for it, that small flicker of resignation. The knight wasn't planning to fight beautifully anymore. He was planning to fight efficiently. And efficiency was the one luxury war always rewarded. In the thick of battle, a knight with a mace looked almost calm. There was no flourish, no parry, no dramatic clash. Just a steady rhythm, a swing, a thud, a fall. The weight did the talking. Every impact sent tremors through the air, a slow percussion of inevitability. Sometimes, when the fog lifted and the battlefields were counted, men found themselves oddly grateful for maces. They ended fights quickly. There was mercy in that kind of finality. The mace was not glamorous, but it was honest. It didn't pretend to be a tool of chivalry or legend. It existed because armor existed, and as long as men built walls around themselves, others would build hammers to break them. When you think about it, the mace is history's sigh of impatience, the moment humanity decided it had tried enough finesse for 1 century. And though poets ignored it and painters avoided it, soldiers remembered it. They knew that beneath all the ceremony of knighthood and all the gold filigree of swords, the outcome of a fight still came down to something simple and ancient force meeting flesh. The mace was the blunt punctuation mark at the end of the Middle Ages' long sentence about glory. It was the moment where the story stopped pretending to be beautiful and became true. Because sometimes survival doesn't need art. It only needs a good swing. If the mace was the grunt of the medieval battlefield, heavy, blunt, and reliable, the warhammer was its clever cousin. Smaller, sharper, and meaner, it was the weapon that understood armor, not as a wall to be crushed, but as a puzzle to be solved. Where the mace simply said, "Hit harder," the warhammer replied, "Hit smarter." At first glance, it doesn't look like much. No elegance, no sweep of blade, no polished edge. Just a short haft, topped by a block of iron, with two very different faces. On one side, a small hammerhead. On the other, a wicked spike curved slightly like the beak of a hawk. But in that modest form, hid one of the most precise and terrifying tools ever carried onto a medieval battlefield. The hammer side did what you might expect it dented things. Helmets, shields, even ribs through steel plate. The flat face transferred energy in the cruelest way possible into bones. A solid hit didn't need to break armor. It broke the man inside it. The spike, however, was the real genius. Forged narrow and hardened, it concentrated all the force of the swing onto a single point, able to pierce where the swords and maces could only bruise. That spike was the knight's answer to physics. The sharper and smaller the point of impact, the more pressure it could deliver enough to punch through iron or steel at just the right angle. You didn't have to tear armor open like paper. You just had to drive the spike through a joint, a visor, or a breastplate, weakened by dents and fatigue. In the hands of a practiced fighter, the warhammer was less a weapon and more a conversation with geometry. Each swing was measured not for power, but for precision. The goal wasn't to shatter, it was to focus. You could aim for the rounded top of a helmet, where the curvature guided blows away, but if you struck just at the base, where neck met plate, the spike slipped in like a key in a lock. The effect was horrifying. Chroniclers describe the aftermath of such fights in terse understatement. Men fell, and their helms were pierced. They rarely added detail, perhaps, because there was little to embellish. The warhammer left its mark not as a cut or a gash, but as a single, perfect whole, neat final, and always fatal. Against armor, it was devastating. Against unarmored men, it was excessive. A single strike could crush a skull or collapse a chest. Against a shield, it could splinter the planks or hook around the edge to yank it away. Its compact head meant it moved faster than a mace and was easier to recover between swings. It was an assassin's tool, disguised as a soldier's. The brilliance of the design was that it didn't get stuck something that plagued axes on the field. Axes with their wide blades bit deeply into armor or bone and sometimes refused to let go. In the middle of a melee, that was death. You didn't have time to wrestle your weapon free while another man tried to introduce his own. The Warhammer solved that elegantly. Its spike pierced cleanly, leaving just enough room to withdraw with a twist of the wrist. No snagging, no hesitation, just the steady rhythm of impact and release. To wield one was to understand patience. You didn't flail, you aimed. You waited for the right moment when your opponent turned, when the sun flashed on the curve of his visor, when his weight shifted just wrong, and then one motion short and sharp. The Warhammer didn't need a long arc. It thrived in close quarters, where every inch of space mattered. It was a surgeon's instrument built for the anatomy of steel. The sight of it alone carried a psychological weight. Swords might inspire fear, but they also inspired hope. There was skill in a sword fight. Perhaps you could parry, deflect, survive. Against a Warhammer, there was no such illusion. The sound it made, that dense percussive thunk, echoed with inevitability. You didn't dance around a hammer. You prayed not to be where it landed. And unlike swords, Warhammers were cheap to make. They didn't require delicate tempering or perfect balance. You could forge one from scrap, fix it to a wooden haft, and you had a weapon that laughed at craftsmanship. Even humble foot soldiers carried them, turning the field into a forest of spikes and hooks. Knights learned to respect and fear them in equal measure. There was something almost industrial about the weapon, a sense that it belonged less to knights and more to the blacksmiths who built their armor. It was poetic in a dark way. The same principles that protected a knight, leverage pressure metallurgy, were the same ones that undid him. The Warhammer was armor's shadow, its natural predator. Hollywood, of course, rarely shows it. It's not cinematic enough. There's no graceful clashing of blades, no ringing sparks, or balletic parries, just blunt impacts and short, efficient movements, too quick, too real. A Warhammer fight would end before the camera had time to adjust. There's nothing romantic about a man falling to a hole in his helmet no wider than a coin. But that is what made the Warhammer the truest weapon of its age. It was honest about the world it came from, a world that had grown tired of pretense. The time of knightly duels and poetic swordplay was fading. Battles were no longer about honor, but about survival in a maze of steel. The Warhammer was the perfect answer to that world, small, cruel, and endlessly practical. If you had stood on a battlefield and watched them used, you would have seen no heroics, only physics in motion. A knight raises his shield. The hammer crashes against it, caving it in. Another tries to parry. The spike slides past, buries itself in the side of his helmet. He falls silently, his body twitching once before going still. the wielder moves on. There's no pause for admiration, no time for sentiment. The weapon demands efficiency, and its master obeys. The hammer was also a symbol of finality. When armies clashed and armor met armor, every clang was a negotiation until someone brought a hammer to the table. That ended the discussion. There were even ceremonial versions, richly gilded, studded with gems carried by nobles as emblems of authority. Even there, the symbolism remained clear. I rule because I can crush. And yet, for all its brutality, there was craftsmanship in its creation. The balance had to be perfect, too heavy, and the swing was slow. Too light, and the blow lacked force. The spike had to be tempered just right, sharp enough to bite, strong enough not to bend. A good hammer fit the hand like an extension of the will. In the right grip, it felt less like a tool and more like inevitability. You can imagine the silence that followed each swing. Not the kind of silence born of peace, but the stunned absence of sound after an impact that changed something fundamental. A dented helm, a broken jaw, a fractured line of soldiers who'd learned too late that armor wasn't salvation. Some historians call the Warhammer the thinking man's mace. It didn't rely on brute strength alone. It required timing, understanding patience qualities that separated the survivor from the corpse. And yet, it was simpler than the sword, more reliable than the axe, more deliberate than the spear. It was the weapon of men who'd stopped believing in glory and started believing in results. There's something chillingly modern about that. In its compact efficiency, the Warhammer feels like the ancestor of every later machine of war, practical, precise, emotionless. It didn't need to look beautiful to do beautiful work. By the 15th century, as armor reached its peak, the hammer had become the great equalizer. It was the quiet reminder that nothing humans build is invincible. Every defense invites its destruction. Every wall calls to its hammer. And so it remained humbly devastating on the belts of knights and foot soldiers alike, unpainted, unglamorous, unmentioned in songs. A weapon of work, not wonder. If you listen closely to those forgotten fields of iron and bone, perhaps you can still hear it, not the clash of swords or the roar of battle, but the dull, rhythmic punctuation of hammers falling steady as a heartbeat, reminding everyone that the age of chivalry had a sound after all. Not a song. A strike. If the sword was a statement of lineage, and the mace a confession of fatigue, the axe was something far more honest, an admission that when it came down to survival, a man needed a tool that worked, not one that impressed. It's funny, really, how the image of the medieval axe has been warped by time and by Hollywood. Modern films give it to the barbarian, the brute, the half-mad raider, foaming at the mouth. The knight, they insist, would never stoop to something so crude. But that's not how it was. Knights did use axes, and they used them gladly. They were not lumberjack tools stolen from a firewood pile. They were precision-built, purpose-forged instruments of war. A war axe was not meant for chopping logs. It was meant for making armor cry. The design was elegant in its brutality. The head was small, sometimes no larger than a man's fist, forged of tempered steel, and mounted on a shaft of ash or oak. The edge curved just enough to bite deep without wedging. The back might end in a spike for thrusting. Some had slender beards. The lower part of the blade extended downward like a hook, useful for catching reins, yanking shields, or pulling a rider from his horse. Others were double-headed, symmetrical, and balanced like an executioner's certainty. But the genius of the axe was in its simplicity. Every ounce of weight was concentrated at the tip, and that concentration made it terrifying. When a knight swung his sword, the force distributed along the blade. When he swung his axe, the entire world narrowed to that single edge. The strike did not glide, it landed. And where it landed, things broke. Against armor, it was not subtle. A good hit could shear through mail, split a helmet's seam, or cave in the thin plates along the limbs. Against shields, it was devastating. The bearded edge could bite through wood and leather catch on the rim and tear the defense straight out of an opponent's hand. And against horses, though, the chronicles rarely say it aloud, it could end a mounted charge in one desperate swing. To face an axe was to face immediacy. The sword hinted the mace threatened, but the axe simply arrived. Knights trained with them as seriously as with swords. There were techniques, ways to hook, to feint, to pivot. The haft was not merely a handle, but a weapon in itself. The shaft could be used to block or jab. The weapon's rhythm was brutal, but precise, its arc short enough for control, yet long enough for reach. In the crush of battle, when there was no room for elegance, the axe made sense. It was also refreshingly democratic. A peasant could make one. A blacksmith could improve one. And a noble could die to one. The weapon crossed social lines in a way few others did. It didn't care who swung it, only how hard. In the right hands, the axe was faster than people think. The weight at the head gave it momentum, but the haft acted as a counterbalance, allowing for rapid recovery between swings. You could parry a sword and counter-strike in the same motion. You could hook the blade around a shield's rim and pull it down, exposing the man behind it to the inevitable. You could even use the spike on the reverse end to puncture plate in those tender seams beneath the arms or behind the knees. There was nothing ornamental about any of this. The axe did not flirt, it finished. And yet for all its savagery, knights admired it. They knew a weapon that told the truth when they felt one. The sword might declare lineage and grace, but the axe whispered something deeper, an understanding of how fragile human bodies really were beneath all the ceremony. Imagine the field after the clash helmet's dented shields cleaved the air, thick with the smell of sweat and metal. Amid the noise, you could always tell when an axe had spoken. The sound was a blunt chunk, a solid punctuation mark at the end of a life. Swords rang, axes thudded. One was music, the other was fact. It's remarkable how many medieval effigies show knights clutching axes. Even kings were buried with them. The Bayeux Tapestry, that great stitched memory of conquest, is full of them, long-hafted and terrifying, swung by both common soldiers and high-born men alike. There was pride in it. An axe was not crude. It was confidence forged into form. But try telling that to the movies. Hollywood dislikes axes. They're hard to choreograph. They don't glide across the screen with balletic grace. There's no clashing of edges, no bright spray of sparks. Just short, brutal arcs and sudden endings, too real, too fast, too final. The camera prefers beauty, and the axe refuses to provide it. On film, a sword fight can last minutes. In truth, an axe duel might last seconds. One wrong parry, one mistimed dodge, and the fight was over. There's no poetry in that, only reality. And reality, as we've learned, doesn't sell tickets. But in the Middle Ages, poetry wasn't the goal. Survival was. And for survival, the axe was perfect. There's something deeply symbolic about that balance between tool and weapon. The axe had existed long before knighthood, before castles, before chivalry, and would exist long after. It had felled trees, built homes, shaped ships, and defended those same homes when the world came knocking with fire and ambition. It was civilization's paradox, creation and destruction, wrapped into one wooden handle. When a knight hefted an axe, he was borrowing that legacy. This wasn't just a weapon. It was a reminder that all grandeur begins with utility. The same edge that could split timber for a chapel could split armor for a cause. The difference was purpose, not form. In battle, its versatility was unmatched. The shorter, one-handed axe was favored in tight formations, where space was scarce and timing was everything. The longer poleaxe, a grander cousin, was a knight's nightmare machine axe blade, on one side hammerhead or spike on the other, and often a small spear point at the top for thrusting. It was the Swiss Army knife of death, capable of chopping, stabbing, and crushing in one instrument of elegant horror. Poleaxes became the knight's weapon of choice in tournaments and real warfare alike. Manuals describe intricate techniques, parries, hooks, throws, all centered around its shifting balance. It was a dancer's weapon for men who had no intention of dancing. Even its flaws were honest. The axe could tire its wielder quickly. It demanded commitment with every swing. But that was part of its truth. Once you began the motion, you had to finish it. There was no half measure, no graceful recovery. You were all in, or you were done. And perhaps that's what made it terrifying to witness. Watching a man swing an axe was like watching an argument you already knew the ending to. It was final before it began. On the battlefield, amid the roar and the churn of feet and hooves, axes flashed like punctuation marks in the narrative of chaos. You could see the arc of polished steel catch the morning light for just an instant before it disappeared into the crush of bodies. And then a pause, a collapse, a silence in that one small corner of the world. The weapon was also symbolic of adaptability. Where the sword demanded craftsmanship and lineage, the axe could be born anywhere. You could forge one in a frontier village or a royal armory, and it would serve the same. In that sense, it was the great equalizer, the reminder that no matter how much silver you wore, the right weight of iron could still bring you to your knees. Perhaps that's why the axe endured in the imagination of both peasants and nobles. It was not the weapon of dreams, but of certainty. It had no need to pretend. Knights understood that better than anyone. Beneath their shining armor and their heraldic colors, they were men who knew fatigue, panic, and the dull ache of survival. They knew that elegance faded quickly in mud. They knew that sometimes, when all the careful plans fell apart, you reached for what you could trust, something that would still work when everything else didn't. That thing was often an axe. When battles ended and weapons were gathered from the field, it was the axes that came back dented but whole. The swords snapped, the maces bent, the hammers lost their spikes, But the axe, rough and stubborn, simply waited for another hand to lift it. In that persistence, it became almost symbolic of humanity itself, unrefined, practical, tireless. A reminder that survival has always belonged, not to the prettiest, but to the most adaptable. And so, while poets sang of swords, history was written with axes on shields, on helmets, on the skulls of men who thought armor made them safe. 1,000 years later, the sword still shines on the screen, and the axe remains in the shadows, too real, too crude, too honest. But if the knights themselves could speak, if they could whisper across the centuries, they would tell you this: the axe was no barbarian's toy. It was the instrument of those who understood that victory, like firewood, must sometimes be chopped rather than crafted. Because when the banners fell and the world turned noisy and red, the axe didn't promise glory. It promised results. And in the end, that was all that mattered. If swords were the dreamers of war, elegant, personal, beautifully impractical, then spears were the realists. They didn't need ceremony or praise. They didn't shine in paintings, nor did poets waste ink describing them. But they ruled the battlefield just the same. Every age of war has its quiet monarch, and in the Middle Ages that monarch was the spear. It was the simplest of ideas, a stick with a point. And yet, it conquered the imagination of armies for centuries. The spear was cheap, reliable, and terrifyingly effective. A sword required skill. A mace required muscle. A spear required only nerve and a good grip. You could hand one to a farmer, teach him which end to hold, and suddenly he had the power to keep a knight at bay. That, more than any noble blade, changed history. Its genius lay in distance. The reach of a spear meant control. Before an enemy could get close enough to swing, he had to survive the forest of points that waited for him. And that forest was not metaphorical. Picture a line of men, shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping, each holding a spear angled forward. The air above them shimmered with iron, hundreds of glinting tips, motionless until the command came. When they moved as one. It wasn't glamorous work. It was rhythm. A spear wall didn't dance. It breathed. Step, thrust, withdraw. Step, thrust, withdraw. The formation's power came from its unity. Every man a piece of a greater creature. A living machine of wood and steel. To break through such a wall was like trying to walk into a hedge of thorns that bled you back. This was the backbone of early medieval warfare: shield walls, pike formations, ranks of men bound by discipline more than courage. In these tight formations, individual heroism mattered less than cooperation. The spear democratized survival. And when the line held, it was magnificent in its simplicity. There was no art, no flourish, no chance for a duelist's pride. Only the steady push and pull, the grunt of effort, the dull percussion of wood against armor. It was exhausting, brutal, and effective. A sword could make a man legendary. A spear could make a nation. Even the Vikings, so often imagined as wild berserkers, understood this. Their shield walls were marvels of discipline. Each man's round shield overlapping his neighbor's, each spear thrust emerging like the tongue of a serpent from the gaps. No chaos, no frenzy, just precision. The battle was not a brawl. It was a slow motion negotiation with death. And then there were the pike blocks of later centuries' forests that walked. The Swiss perfected them, columns of men wielding pikes twice their height, advancing like a wall of sharpened trees. Against cavalry, they were almost divine. A charging knight faced not one spear, but dozens, all poised to meet him at once. The horse often saw it before the rider did that impossible wall of glittering death and tried to stop. Momentum didn't allow it, which brings us to the lance. If the spear was the patient philosopher of the battlefield, the lance was its reckless poet. The spear's elegance came from control, the lance's from chaos. It wasn't wielded by a man on his feet, but by a man on a charging horse, a creature of muscle and terror that could reach speeds of 30 miles an hour. The lance transformed that momentum into a weapon, a single focused explosion of force. To see it used in earnest was to watch controlled disaster. Each charge was a promise one man's life balanced on a single narrow point of wood and steel. A knight couched his lance beneath his arm, its butt tucked against his saddle, its tip leveled at the gap between enemy shields or the joint of a visor. Then he lowered his helmet's visor, muttered a prayer, and gave his horse the spurs. The ground trembled. What followed was not the graceful spectacle Hollywood loves to show, not two men galloping toward each other in slow motion, while their capes fluttered nobly in the wind. It was chaos, compressed into seconds. The air filled with dust and thunder. The horse's muscles quivered beneath the armor's weight. The rider gritted his teeth as the wind howled against the slit of his visor. He couldn't see much, just a blur of motion and the narrowing of distance. And then impact. To the onlooker, it might seem like a single collision, but to the rider, it was an earthquake that lived in his arm. The lance struck with the force of a small car crash. Wood splintered, iron screeched, men flew backward. Sometimes both riders went down, sometimes neither did. Often the lance shattered into a storm of fragments, the knight already reaching for his sword or mace as the momentum carried him past. Real lances were not made to survive. They were made to break. The shattering dissipated some of the energy so that the knight's arm wasn't torn from his shoulder. And yet, even with that, bones broke. Hands went numb, fingers dislocated. The idea of controlling that much speed through a wooden shaft was madness, brilliant, terrifying madness. In jousts, the sportified cousin of battle, the violence was tamed in theory. Knights faced each other with blunted tips, their goal to unseat rather than kill. But even then, injuries were common. Horses stumbled, men fell, necks snapped. The crowds loved it, of course. Chivalry at its core was performance art with a high mortality rate. On the battlefield, however, the lance was no game. When an entire line of cavalry charged, the world seemed to fold inward. 1,000 hooves striking in rhythm, the air thick with banners and cries, sunlight flashing on metal like the heartbeat of the sun itself. Infantrymen stood braced, spears forward, eyes wide. And for a few seconds, before impact, the field held its breath. Then, the two forces met. The sound was like the sky cracking. Some horses impaled themselves on spears. Some riders crashed over the line, their lances skewering men like pins through parchment. The first rank might die instantly, but the second pushed forward, trampling over the wreckage of both men and animals. No one walked away from that unshaken. The spear's role was to make that moment survivable. It was the equalizer, the line between courage and disaster. A peasant with a spear could kill a lord with a lance, and that simple truth haunted the nobility for centuries. It was the quiet revenge of geometry reach versus speed physics versus pride. And yet both weapons, the humble spear and the arrogant lance, shared a common genius. They turned distance into dominance. A sword asked you to get close enough to smell your enemy. A spear let you stay just far enough away to live. A lance didn't ask for distance. It demanded it, converting every stride of the horse into a growing inevitability. In a world where armor grew thicker and weapons more ingenious, both tools thrived on the same principle that victory was often a matter of inches. There was beauty in that precision, even amid the carnage. The spear was graceful in its discipline, the lance glorious in its recklessness. One moved like a heartbeat, the other like lightning. Together, they defined medieval warfare more than any gilded sword or painted knight. It's telling that armies throughout history, from the Greeks to the Romans, from Vikings to the French and English, all relied on variations of the same design. The spear never went out of style because it never stopped working. Even as technology evolved, its core principle remained untouched. To this day, the idea of reaching farther than your enemy remains the foundation of combat. The lance, for its part, left the battlefield as soon as gunpowder arrived, but lingered in the imagination. It became the emblem of knightly courage, immortalized in tournaments, in paintings, in the romantic nonsense of later centuries. People remembered the charge, the dust, the banners, the blinding moment of impact, and forgot the screams, the broken ribs, the dying horses. But perhaps that's how memory works. It smooths the edges, edits the noise, and leaves us with the myth we can bear. If you strip away the poetry, though you find something pure beneath it all, a lesson about humanity's eternal relationship with simplicity. The spear and the lance were nothing but sharpened extensions of ourselves, one meant to keep the world away, the other to crash into it head first. Both were perfect in their honesty. The spear said, "Live another minute." The lance said, "Win or die trying." And somewhere between those two philosophies, between the calm line of spearmen and the thunder of charging cavalry, the Middle Ages found its rhythm, its terror, its fleeting idea of glory. Because in the end, for all the shining armor and chivalric vows, war was not about beauty. It was about reach. And in that contest, the spear and the lance were kings, quiet, brutal, undeniable kings, ruling not from thrones, but from the trembling space between survival and ruin. By the late Middle Ages, the battlefield had become a forge of invention, a place where physics met fear, and survival demanded not beauty, but balance. Armor had reached its pinnacle, transforming knights into walking fortresses. Yet every fortress invites a siege, and the answer to that siege was the poleaxe, the most ingenious, versatile, and terrifying piece of medieval engineering ever swung by human hands. At first glance, the poleaxe looks almost excessive, as though its maker couldn't decide what kind of weapon it wanted to be. An axe blade on one side, a hammerhead on the other, a sharp spike rising from the top, and sometimes another spike jutting from the butt of the shaft. It was a weapon with no wasted space, a complete argument against specialization. Every angle had a purpose. Every edge meant business. It was the Swiss Army knife of war, centuries before Switzerland existed in any unified sense, except this one didn't open bottles or trim rope. It opened armor. The poleaxe was born in an age of contradictions. Knights were at their most invincible, encased in gleaming plate-riding tall horses that seemed almost divine, and yet that very invincibility demanded new ways to break it. The sword had long since ceded its throne to the realities of steel. The mace and Warhammer had proven their worth in blunt force, but each had limits. The poleaxe, however, was a masterpiece of compromise, long enough for reach, heavy enough for crushing, sharp enough for cutting, and balanced enough for precision. Picture it, a haft of sturdy oak, perhaps 6 feet long, wrapped in iron bands to prevent splintering, capped at both ends with steel. At its head, a triangular spear point thrust upward, ready to puncture armor gaps or drive a fallen knight into stillness. One side bore a curved axe blade wide enough to cleave through a helm's side. The other held a hammer, ridged and squared for denting plate like tinfoil. It was brutal beauty in the form of geometry weight, perfectly distributed, so a man could switch from slashing to smashing to stabbing in a single fluid motion. And when used by someone who knew what he was doing, it was a symphony of destruction. The manuals, those grave, meticulous books of violence, show the poleaxe in all its forms. 2 armored men face each other, each holding their weapon upright like a staff. Then, in the next illustration, one has stepped inside, using the spike to hook his opponent's knee. Another plate shows a downward strike, the axe's edge curving into a visor. Another, a thrust with the top spike into the narrow gap between breastplate and gorget. It reads like a dance, but one choreographed by someone who understood that grace is sometimes best expressed through the collapse of an enemy. The poleaxe wasn't only a weapon of battle, it was also a weapon of sport, the chosen instrument of knightly duels and tournaments. In controlled combat, 2 knights, fully armored, would face off in a fenced arena, each with a poleaxe. There were rules, at least nominally. Strikes to certain parts of the body were forbidden. Killing blows were to be avoided. But steel doesn't listen to rules. A tournament poleaxe was often blunted, its edges rounded. But even so, the force of a strike could shatter ribs through plate, knock a man unconscious, or dislocate shoulders. The audience gasped at every blow. To them, it was chivalry in motion. To the men inside the armor, it was survival in slow motion. And yet, for all its savagery, the poleaxe was not clumsy. It was precision, made manifest. Its balance was so refined that a trained knight could move it like an extension of his body. The weapon's center of gravity sat close to the hands, allowing both reach and control. You could strike with the axe, then reverse into a hammer blow without losing tempo. You could thrust like a spear or jab like a quarterstaff. It was everything a knight needed when his world became too close for comfort. Against armor, it was the great equalizer. The axe blade could shear through thinner plates or cut straps and fastenings. The hammer side dented and crushed where cutting failed. The top spike pierced where both struggled. Even the butt spike, known as the Q, served as a weapon of last resort, a brutal reminder that retreat was never truly safe. In the press of battle, poleaxe combat was a nightmare of noise and motion. Imagine a melee, dozens of men in heavy armor shouting, shoving, swinging these 6-foot engines of physics. Blows rained from every direction, the clang of impact mingling with the grunt of effort. There were no long duels, no graceful fencing, only split-second opportunities for a strike, a trip, a hook. Because yes, the poleaxe could grapple. Its design made it as much a tool for control as for destruction. Knights used the hooked edge to catch an opponent's arm, neck, or leg. They could pull a shield aside, trip an enemy backward, or wrench a weapon out of his grip. Once down, the fallen man faced a cruel decision roll onto his back and expose his chest, or stay face down and risk a spike through the spine. These moments, close, suffocating, intimate, were the truest expression of medieval combat. There was no romance in them, only determination. The poleaxe, for all its versatility, demanded focus. One mistake, and the weight of the weapon could pull you off balance. One missed guard, and your opponent's counterstrike could fold your armor like paper. It's easy to forget how much science lived inside the savagery. Every edge, every angle, every inch of steel was designed to solve a specific problem. Against plate, you needed focus. Against mail, momentum. Against a man on horseback, reach. Against a man on foot, leverage. The poleaxe answered all of it. When modern reenactors handle replicas, the first thing they notice isn't the weight, it's the balance. It doesn't feel awkward or heavy. It feels alive. Swing it, and it moves with you. The shaft flexes slightly, absorbing shock. The head sings through the air with a sound both reassuring and horrifying. It's the sound of precision wearing a mask of chaos. Hollywood has never known what to do with the poleaxe. It's too technical, too short-lived in combat to look graceful on screen. There's no endless exchange of parries, no choreographed acrobatics. Just a handful of decisive movements, a hook, a strike, a thrust, and it's over. Real fighting rarely lasts long enough for dialogue, but in the dusty pages of history, the poleaxe sits quietly smug in its perfection. It didn't need an audience. It only needed to work. Knights loved it because it made them complete again. Armor had turned them into tanks, but tanks still need weapons that suit their weight. The poleaxe was that harmony, the bridge between strength and skill. It didn't rely on speed alone, or power alone, but on the marriage of both. It rewarded discipline. It punished arrogance. Even training with it was a lesson in humility. A good knight spent hours in the yard learning the feel of it, the twist of the wrist that turned a swing into a hook, the timing of a thrust that slipped between plates, the subtle shift of stance that turned defense into counterattack. The manuals instructed not just how to hit, but how to move, how to breathe, how to turn the weapon into thought. Because the poleaxe was never about blind aggression. It was about control of space, of rhythm, of physics. When two masters faced each other, their fight resembled less a brawl and more a negotiation. Feints and traps, shifts of balance, sudden reversals. The weapon could strike catch and block all in the same motion. To outsiders, it looked chaotic. To those inside the armor, it was choreography, a deadly waltz measured in inches. And when the blow finally landed, there was no mistaking it. The hammer rang against steel, sending shivers through bone. The axe bit into plate with a crunch that echoed like a closing door. The spike slipped through a gap, vanishing with surgical certainty. The fight ended before the mind could register that it had truly begun. Such precision, such economy of violence could only have been born from centuries of learning what didn't work. The sword failed. The mace lacked subtlety. The hammer lacked versatility. The axe lacked reach. The spear lacked flexibility. The poleaxe somehow was all of them and none of them. It stood as the culmination of medieval pragmatism, a weapon designed not for ideals, but for outcomes. And yet within its violence there was artistry. The weapon's proportions followed intuitive geometry. The head 1/3 the length of the haft. The balance point, resting where the hands naturally met. The best were works of craftsmanship. Their steel, polished, their edges perfect, their shafts reinforced with Langot's long iron strips that protected the wood from splintering. Some were gilded, engraved, even blessed. Because even knights who knew better couldn't resist dressing death in beauty. On the field, though, that beauty vanished beneath grime and blood. The poleaxe became what it was always meant to be, not a symbol, but a solution. When the sun set on a battlefield littered with armor and bone, it was the poleaxe that remained standing, its edges dented, its shaft nicked its weight unchanged. It did not care about victory songs. It cared about leverage, reach, and gravity. And maybe that's why it's so haunting to think about now. The sword was art. The spear was philosophy. The hammer was science. But the poleaxe was understanding. It was the moment humanity looked at its own inventions, armor, chivalry, nobility, and quietly admitted, we can break this too. For in its form was everything the Middle Ages learned about war, that the best weapon is not the prettiest nor the simplest, but the one that adapts, the one that does exactly what needs to be done. Nothing more, nothing less. That was the poleaxe, the end of pretense, the triumph of design, the quiet masterpiece that turned knights into engineers of death and battlefields into laboratories of physics. When the smoke cleared, the poleaxe did not boast. It merely leaned against its fallen master's side, as if to say, I did what you asked. The rest is yours to carry. In the grand theater of medieval combat, of lances, shattering maces, crushing, and swords flashing in the sunlight, there was always one weapon waiting patiently in the wings, small and silent, reserved for the last act. The dagger. It was never the star of the show, but it was the one that closed the curtain. When all the great weapons failed, when the spear snapped, the sword dulled, the mace dented, and the man was no longer standing tall, but kneeling, gasping, crawling in the mud, that was when the dagger came out. It was not a declaration. It was punctuation. The final sharp period at the end of a sentence, no one wanted to finish. To hold a dagger was to understand proximity in its most brutal form. You could smell the other man's breath. You could feel the tremor in his armor, the raggedness of his lungs beneath the metal. It was not the weapon of distance or spectacle, but of conclusion. Knights never went anywhere without one. The dagger was as essential as the sword, sometimes more so. It was the tool of both living and dying a companion for every task the day demanded. In battle, it was for killing. In peace, for cutting rope, carving meat, cleaning fish. It was the one blade that blurred the line between weapon and utensil. There were many kinds, but none more feared than the rondel dagger, named for the circular guards that capped its hilt and pommel like twin coins. Its blade was long, slender, and stiff, often triangular or diamond-shaped, forged, not to slice, but to pierce. No edges wasted on decoration. No flourishes for show, just a point, an intent, and the strength to follow through. Unlike the wide blades of swords, a rondel dagger didn't care for drama. It was made for armor gaps, those small human places where metal had to yield for movement. The inside of the elbow, the armpit, the groin, the neck beneath the visor's rim. Each was a door to the fragile being inside the fortress of steel. The dagger didn't knock. It slipped in quietly, uninvited. Medieval combat manuals dedicate entire sections to what came after the fall, when men in armor crashed together and the fight became a wrestling match in steel. The sword was useless here, too long, too heavy. So knights went to the ground, like wrestlers, grappling, twisting, pinning. You can almost hear the grunts, the groans of metal against earth, the desperate panting as each tried to find leverage. This was when the dagger mattered. Imagine it, two men rolling in the mud armor, slick with sweat and rain. A knee pressed into a breastplate, a gauntlet forcing down a visor. One hand gropes for the hilt at the hip, the rondel dagger always there, always waiting. It's drawn in a heartbeat, the blade flashing once in the dim light. There's no wide arc, no heroic swing, just a short, sharp thrust, maybe a muffled cry, then silence. It was not an act of rage. It was an act of inevitability. The manuals show this clearly, the neat diagrams of knights kneeling over each other, daggers poised at vulnerable spots. Notes written in cramped Latin explain where to thrust, how to hold the wrist, how to trap an opponent's arm so he couldn't stop you. There's a detached calm to it, the tone of an anatomy lesson. Here press beneath the arm for the plates, there are weak. Drive upward beneath the chin. Do not slash, it is useless. The writers never called it murder. They called it finishing the fight. That's the truth of the dagger. It didn't belong to the beginning of battles, but to their endings. When knights wrestled each other to the ground, the dagger turned combat into something terrifyingly intimate, closer than any other act between two people. Death at arm's length, breath to breath. Even the weapon's design reflected this intimacy. The handle of a rondel dagger was narrow, often octagonal, fitting neatly into a gauntleted fist. The circular guards kept the hand from slipping during a thrust, a simple but vital detail when blood slicked the world. And the blade's stiffness ensured it wouldn't bend when meeting the resistance of armor or flesh. It was in every sense an executioner's instrument carried by soldiers. Yet it wasn't all violence. In daily life, the dagger was simply practical. Every man from knight to peasant carried one. You could cut bread with it, repair straps, open letters, dig out splinters. It was the medieval equivalent of a multi-tool not glamorous, but indispensable. And because it was always there, always ready, it became the natural choice when moments turned desperate. A knight might bless his sword before battle, name it, polish it, pray over it. His dagger, though, needed none of that. It was a quiet friend. It asked for nothing and delivered everything. On the battlefield, it hung from the right hip or chest, easily reachable with either hand. In the chaos of close quarters, when visibility vanished and shouting filled the air like smoke, a man didn't think he reached. The hand knew where the dagger was, even when the mind didn't. The dagger's lethality lay not in strength, but in placement. It didn't need to break armor. It only needed to find the spaces armor couldn't cover. Beneath the arm. At the base of the skull. Between the plates, at the hip. Each thrust was small, measured, deliberate. A professional act. You see it described again and again in chronicles, hidden in polite euphemisms. The knight was subdued. The enemy was dispatched. The fallen were made still. These were all polite ways of saying someone knelt down and used a dagger to make sure the man beneath him didn't get back up. There's something profoundly unsettling about how ordinary it was. The dagger was not a symbol of cruelty. It was a tool of necessity. No one hated it for what it did. They simply accepted it as one accepts the final toll of a bell after a long day. And yet, because of that intimacy, the dagger carried a quiet terror that larger weapons never did. To kill with a sword was to strike at a distance. To kill with a dagger was to step into another man's shadow. You had to hold him, feel his struggle, see his eyes. The blade was short enough that there was no avoiding what you were doing. Every thrust was a choice made inches from consequence. It's no wonder knights called them the last argument. The dagger was also democratic in a way. It belonged to everyone: nobles, soldiers, thieves, women, merchants. Where a sword might proclaim status, a dagger was simply human. Everyone needed something sharp. In dark alleys, it was the weapon of the desperate. On battlefields, the weapon of survivors. Some daggers were works of art: gilded hilts, jeweled pommels, inscriptions invoking God or fortune. Others were nothing but rough steel and wood blackened by soot, plain as hunger. But in use, they were all the same. No blade cared about its decorations once it met flesh. There's an odd sort of poetry in how small they were. Amid the towering weapons of the age, the great swords, pole axes, halberds, the dagger seemed almost humble, and yet it was the one that decided how most battles ended. Even the great heroes of the chronicles, those larger-than-life knights who lived by sword and banner, often died by dagger. Not in glorious charges, but in the mud on their backs, with someone's knee on their chest, and a short blade finding its mark beneath the gorget. The dagger was the last truth of the battlefield, the reminder that when all the noise faded, war always came down to two people, one breath, and a single point of steel. Off the field, it carried the same ambiguity. At the banquet table, it sliced meat. In a back alley, it settled debts. On campaign, it cut rope and bread in equal measure. Knights carried them into battle, and priests carried them on pilgrimages. It was never only a weapon. It was the daily punctuation of life. Even the act of giving a dagger held meaning. It was a sign of trust and warning all at once. Lovers exchanged them as tokens. Kings gifted them as favors. Enemies used them as answers. A dagger was a promise to defend or to finish. When armor finally faded from fashion, replaced by gunpowder and fabric, the dagger stayed. Its form changed its names, multiplied stiletto poignard miséricorde, but its purpose did not. The French name miséricorde means mercy, and that tells you everything. The mercy dagger was the blade knights used to give their wounded comrades the gift of an ending. A thin, sharp thrust beneath the arm, or through the visor, quick and clean. Mercy by steel. There's something chillingly tender about that. A man kneeling over another, whispering a prayer, and then pushing the blade home to stop the pain. The same weapon that had ended lives in fury could now end them in compassion. Perhaps that's why the dagger endured so long, because it understood both sides of the human heart. And in a way, it still does. Modern knives, soldiers' bayonets, even utility blades, all are descendants of that same medieval truth, that sometimes the simplest tools are the most necessary. If you look closely at a museum display, at the small dagger resting between the grander weapons, you might feel the quiet it carries. It doesn't boast. It doesn't gleam for attention. It just waits, still patient, certain of its place in the order of things. Because the dagger has no illusions about what it is. It knows that war begins with trumpets and banners, but ends in whispers. And when the shouting stops and the heroes fall, it's the dagger that finishes the story, small, precise, unflinching. The last touch of cold truth in a world of loot lies. If there was ever a weapon that deserved better public relations, it was the shield. History remembered the swords that gleamed, the lances that shattered, and the axes that sang. But the shield, that humble slab of wood and hide that kept its master alive longer than any other tool of war, rarely got a song. Perhaps because the shield's glory was in what it stopped, rather than what it did. Hollywood, of course, has lied to you again. There. The shield is a delicate thing, a stage prop gracefully angled to catch a sword blow. A neat bit of choreography that keeps actors' faces visible to the camera. In the real world, shields were less ballet, more brutality. They were not there to politely block. They were there to end momentum, to absorb, to strike, to shove, to survive the unspeakable. Because shields were not passive. They were weapons. A good shield bash could rattle teeth inside a helmet. A shove with the rim could break ribs, tear balance, open space for a follow-up strike. Knights used them to punch, to hook, to push enemies back into the mud. In the press of battle, where every inch mattered, the shield was both wall and hammer. And unlike the weapons that broke bones, or armor shields broke rhythm, and rhythm was life. Close your eyes and imagine it. Two men locked together, one raising his sword, the other lunging forward, not to block, but to hit. The edge of the shield catches the sword arm, slams into the chest, forces a stumble. Before the sword can recover, the attacker follows with a mace to the head. Quick, brutal, efficient. In those moments, the shield wasn't a defensive object. It was pure offense, masquerading as caution. Even in larger formations, shields were the body and bones of any army. Shield walls, the ancient and medieval answer to chaos, were among the simplest and most effective tactics ever invented. A line of men shoulder-to-shoulder shields overlapping, forming a barrier of wood and will. Behind them, spears waited like fangs. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't even particularly glamorous. It was just necessary. When the first rank braced and the enemy slammed into them, it felt like being hit by a door that hated you. The shock traveled through arms and spines. Shields creaked, splintered, groaned, and the men behind them gritted their teeth and pushed back. That word push defines the shield's real purpose. Every medieval battle was at its core a contest of pressure. It wasn't about who had the sharper sword. It was about who could hold the line longer before exhaustion or fear cracked it open. And that was where shields earned their reputation. They broke often, but that was the point. Better the shield break than the man. A knight or soldier didn't weep when his shield splintered. He was grateful. A broken shield meant it had done its job. Each dent, each split plank, each shattered rim was a wound the man himself didn't take. And he'd repair it, reinforce it, or replace it before the next fight, because there would always be a next fight. Let's talk about how they were made those unsung guardians of bone and breath. Forget the iron slabs you see in fantasy art. Real shields were a masterpiece of organic engineering. They began with layered wood, often lime alder or poplar, flexible enough to bend without snapping strong enough to take a beating. Planks were glued together with animal hide glue, sometimes reinforced with linen soaked in resin. The face was covered in rawhide or leather, stretched tight, and left to dry, forming a tough, elastic skin. The edges were rimmed in metal or rawhide bands, both to protect the wood and to stop enemy blades from biting too deep. When you look at the cross-section of a surviving medieval shield, it's almost delicate, but that delicacy was deception. Every material worked in harmony. The wood gave shape. The hide absorbed impact. The glue bonded everything into one breathing, flexible structure. It wasn't meant to be invincible. It was meant to give. A rigid shield would crack like glass under a strong blow. A flexible one absorbed it, the fibers stretching, creaking alive for a moment with the memory of survival. And when one did finally break, it didn't explode like in movies. It failed gradually, the center bowing the rim, peeling apart the handle, splintering. The man behind it felt it happen in his bones. That's why soldiers carried more than one when they could. Each design had its own personality. The round shields of the Vikings were made for movement light, fast, able to twist and redirect blows. The kite-shaped shields of Norman knights offered full-body coverage, perfect for cavalry. Later, as armor improved and battles changed, shields shrank again into heater shapes, smaller and more symbolic, still useful. But now, carrying coats of arms, instead of being the only thing between you and a spear. That coat of arms wasn't decoration. It was necessity. In the swirling madness of battle dust, mud blood noise, you needed to know who was who. Painted heraldry turned shields into identification markers, family names, portable banners. The blue and gold cross, the red lion, the black chevron. All these symbols were medieval GPS for the chaos of combat. A knight could find his lord's banner, his allies, his enemies. In tournaments, heraldry kept death polite. On real fields, it kept death organized. But the irony was that after the first few minutes of battle, most shields didn't look like much of anything. The paint chipped away blood, turned the colors dull, and the leather tore. By the end of a fight, every shield was a story, scarred, cracked, stained its heraldry, hidden beneath the fingerprints of violence. The shield, more than any weapon, carried history in its damage. Each mark was an echo of something that could have been fatal. You could read a man's life by his shield. The clean ones belonged to the dead. The battered ones belonged to survivors. When we picture knights, we always imagine them charging forward, sword in one hand, shield in the other. But we forget how much of that posture was faith. The man trusted his shield completely. When the arrows came hundreds at a time, hissing through the sky, he ducked behind it and prayed it would hold. When the cavalry charge thundered near, he braced it against the ground like a barricade. And when someone swung a blade that could cleave a limb, he trusted that patchwork of wood and hide to take the blow instead. And usually it did. Even in one-on-one combat, the shield was more than just protection. It was a strategy. A knight could feint with it, bash with it, blind his opponent by flashing the metal rim into their eyes. Some shields had pointed bosses' domed centers of iron or bronze that turned defense into offense. A jab from the boss could break a nose through a visor or crack a collarbone. The rhythm of a fight wasn't block strike, as Hollywood shows it. It was hit, push, shove, bash, stab, recover. The shield wasn't a pause between attacks, it was the attack. The shield even dictated breathing. Knights learned to inhale behind it, using it as a momentary barrier from the choking dust and the sharp smell of blood and sweat that clung to every battle. Behind it, you could catch a breath. Behind it, you were alive. And that's why losing it was one of the worst things that could happen. A dropped sword could be replaced. A broken mace could be kicked aside. But without a shield, you were naked. In some accounts, knights who lost their shields were forced to retreat not because they were cowards, but because they knew the odds had just shifted against them. Without that flat, battered friend between them and the world they were exposed to. The 1,000 little accidents that make up every death in war. It's strange, then, how little romance the shield receives in memory. Perhaps because it was too selfless. Its job was not to shine, but to take the hits so something else could. Every chip and crack on its surface was a small, unrecorded act of heroism. When you stood behind one, you could feel it doing its work. The vibration of impacts, the warmth of the sun on the painted leather, the weight of it digging into your forearm after hours of holding. It wasn't comfortable. The straps cut into flesh. The rim bruised the hand. The longer you fought, the heavier it felt, as though it were slowly absorbing the weight of everything that wanted you dead. And when the battle ended, it was the first thing you checked. The sword could wait. The shield told the truth. Its surface was a diary, each scar a line of testimony written in splinters. Some shields survived. Their owners passed down through families, repaired, repainted, reused. Others were buried with their knights laid across the chest like a wooden promise that even in death they would guard one last time. There's something almost noble about that, the idea that protection itself can be heroic. The sword might win glory, but the shield preserves it. Even now, when we speak of defense of loyalty of faith, we call it a shield. The word never left us. It lingers in our language because it means something universal. The thing that stands between you and harm, not for glory, but because it must. And maybe that's why shields feel so human. They are not weapons of dominance, but of endurance. They break often, and that's the point. To protect is to accept damage in someone else's place. In every era, in every story, the shield is the same battered faithful and overworked. It never complains, never boasts, never pretends to be anything more than what it is, a wall with a handle. And yet without it, every night would have been just another story that ended too soon. Because if swords were the dreams of battle and armor, the illusion of safety, the shield was the truth. Heavy, imperfect, and absolutely necessary. It didn't sparkle. It didn't sing. It just held. And that, in the end, made it the quietest, truest hero of them all. For all the splendor that armor and chivalry promised, for all the shining swords and proud banners fluttering against the wind, the truth of medieval combat almost always ended face down in the mud. Not with elegant swordplay, not with graceful choreography, but with two men wrestling, grunting, slipping, and clawing at each other inside 40 pounds of steel until one found a way to make the other stop breathing. Knights were first and foremost wrestlers. They had to be, because on the battlefield, weapons failed. Hands slipped, visibility vanished, and distance, that fragile comfort between two armed men, collapsed into chaos. Once the clash of lines dissolved into the crush of bodies, even the finest swordsman became a grappler. The lance snapped on impact, the sword wedged uselessly against plate, the mace fell from numb fingers. And in that suffocating proximity, there was no room for poetry, only leverage. The manuals of the age, those remarkable books of blood and geometry, knew it well. Between their polite illustrations of fencing guards and weapon stances are pages filled with moves that wouldn't look out of place in a modern wrestling ring, only with considerably worse outcomes. There are throws, hip locks, leg sweeps, chokes, disarms, even takedowns that use the opponent's armor weight against him. These weren't brawls born of desperation. They were trained techniques as formal as a sword parry, as essential as breathing. To fight in armor was to live inside a paradox, invincible from afar, helpless up close. The plates that turned aside arrows also made your movements heavy, your balance treacherous. A single shove, a slip on wet grass, a misjudged step, and suddenly you were on your back, staring at the gray sky through a visor that offered all the visibility of a keyhole. That's when the grappling began. Imagine it. Two knights, colliding like bulls, weapons clanging off helmets, hands locking around each other's arms and shoulders, the sound of steel scraping against steel. Their breath echoes loud inside their helmets, short, desperate bursts. One tries to hook the other's leg to twist to throw. They stumble, crash to the ground together, the impact ringing through the plates. The world becomes a tangle of limbs and mud and weight. At that point, technique and instinct become one. The knight's goal isn't to kill. Immediately, it's to dominate, to control the space, to use gravity and armor as weapons. He might trap his opponent's sword arm, press his knee into the other's chest, wrench back a wrist until something pops. The manuals call these moves by elegant names, but in practice, they were anything but elegant. A man screaming inside his helmet rarely sounds noble. The most famous of these texts, like Fiore de Liberi's Fior di Battaglia or Hans Talhofer's German Fechtbuch, show knights locked in close combat, their swords forgotten, their hands clutching and twisting. In one image, a knight grabs his enemy's visor and drives a dagger through the narrow slit. In another one, knight hooks his foot behind the other's knee and shoves forward, sending him sprawling. The next panel always ends the same way: the prone man pinned the victorious one, kneeling with dagger poised. That dagger, often the rondelle, was the inevitable punctuation mark of every grappling match. Wrestling was the bridge to the dagger, the art of making your opponent still enough for precision. The manuals even show the transition explicitly. After you have thrown him, draw your dagger and strike. The entire sequence is a grim, methodical checklist trip-pin finish. There's nothing glamorous about it. No swirling capes, no witty quips, no drawn-out duels. Just the simple brutality of leverage and proximity. And that's what medieval combat really was. Physics performed at the edge of human endurance. Mud played its part too, a silent, impartial killer. Medieval battlefields were rarely dry. Rain turned everything into sludge. Horses churned the ground into a thick, slippery paste that grabbed at boots and refused to let go. A knight who fell in that filth didn't just risk injury, he risked drowning. His armor, heavy with soaked padding and caked mud, turned from protection into a coffin. One wrong fall could mean death even without an enemy's intervention. There are chronicles describing knights suffocating face down, unable to lift themselves as their own armor pinned them to the ground. Others were trampled underfoot by retreating soldiers. The ground, not the sword, claimed as many lives as any weapon. And yet, training for that chaos was part of a knight's life. Young squires learned to wrestle before they learned to fight with weapons. Strength was only half the lesson. Control was the rest. A knight had to know how to fall, how to twist his weight, how to turn a stumble into a throw. Because in real battle, slipping wasn't shameful, it was inevitable. What mattered was what you did after the fall. A skilled grappler could end a fight faster than any swordsman. Once inside an opponent's guard, the knight could seize the advantage through sheer pressure, literally. Armor made striking inefficient, but made crushing all too easy. A forearm pressed into the throat, a gauntleted hand yanking a visor down over the eyes, a knee grinding into the ribs. These were the moves of men who understood that elegance dies in the dirt. It was close, hot, loud. The air inside the helmets grew foul with breath. Hands slipped on blood and grime. Every joint ached with fatigue. The sound of two armored bodies colliding wasn't metallic, like in films. It was dull, heavy, a thud that made ribs vibrate. Each breath felt stolen, and in that exhausted tangle, the dagger came out. Not with drama, not even with anger, just inevitability. A quick thrust into the armpit gap, a push beneath the chin, a short jab into the groin where the armor couldn't reach. Then the fight was over. One knight rolled off the other, panting his dagger slick with someone else's ending. The manuals, always calm and methodical, remind students to finish quickly, not out of cruelty, but out of realism. You couldn't afford to wrestle for long. Someone else would always be coming. The battlefield didn't pause for your duel. And that's the part Hollywood never shows. The chaos, the interruptions, the randomness. There were no clear duels lasting minutes, no space for perfect choreography. The battle was a storm. While two knights wrestled in the mud, a third could crash into them from the side. Arrows might fall. A horse might stumble over the heap of struggling bodies. Combat wasn't one-on-one. It was a moving, screaming landscape of collisions. Even victory could be dangerous. A knight rising from a grapple had seconds to regain awareness before someone else's weapon found him. The manuals sometimes advise rolling away after a kill, not from guilt, but from pragmatism. The next opponent wouldn't wait. That's the strange thing about all those medieval dueling images, how calm they look on the page. The artist captures the moment as a clean sequence of motion, like a dance. But the truth those images hide is that real combat was exhaustion incarnate. The ground mattered more than anything. Footing was everything. One patch of soft earth could undo hours of training. That's why knights preferred flat, dry terrain for tournaments, not out of vanity, but survival. Mud robbed you of control. It stole your stance, turned strength into weakness. It made you humble. In such conditions, grappling wasn't a choice. It was gravity's demand. Two armored men couldn't help but collide, couldn't help but grab onto each other to stay upright. Once that happened, weapons were liabilities. The sword became an awkward club, the poleaxe too long, the mace too slow. Hands and hips took over. There's a passage in one of the German Fechtbücher that reads, "He who loses his feet loses his life." It wasn't a metaphor. It was the simplest rule of all. To modern eyes, there's something absurd about the idea of knights wrestling. We're conditioned to see them as statues, stoic, upright, noble. But real knights, when you strip away the armor and the myth, were athletes, wrestlers, fighters who sweated, slipped, and bled like anyone else. Theirs was a world where strength met gravity and tried always to bargain with it. Their wrestling wasn't pretty. There were no grand throws that sent men flying like in movies. There were small, efficient movements. A twist here, a pull there, designed to off-balance a man just enough for the dagger to do its work. And if you think this was somehow less dignified than swordplay, you're half right. It was less dignified, but it was also more real. It stripped combat of illusion, reducing it to its core, two beings trying not to die. The armor clanked, the mud sucked at boots, the sky pressed down. The knights rolled and strained, neither able to breathe properly. And then, with one small movement, a shift of hip, a grab of wrist, one gained the upper hand. That's all it took. No audience would cheer for such a moment. It wasn't beautiful, but it was the truth of war. When the chroniclers wrote of heroic deaths, they left out these details. They spoke of bravery, not suffocation. They wrote of honor, not leverage. But if you could whisper with the ghosts of battlefields long buried, they'd tell you this: the end rarely came with a sword. It came with a grunt, a shove, a slip, and a dagger finding its mark. And after it was done, when the survivor staggered to his feet, covered in mud and someone else's last breath, he didn't think of glory. He thought of how heavy the armor felt, how the ground seemed to pull him back down again. He thought of how much of war wasn't fighting at all, but falling and getting up again. That's what grappling taught better than any weapon, that victory wasn't grace. It was persistence. the ability to stay upright longer than the other man. Knights were not statues of iron. They were creatures of movement, muscle, and exhaustion. And beneath the clangor of their weapons, the true music of battle was the sound of bodies colliding, a human rhythm, messy, desperate, undeniable. It was not the sound of glory. It was the sound of survival. For centuries, storytellers have trapped the knight inside his own armor, a lumbering tin can clanking hopelessly under the sun, barely able to move, let alone fight. It's a convenient image, heavy, slow, ridiculous. But it's a lie. The real knight, encased in the steel masterpieces of his age, was not a statue. He was an athlete, a walking fortress that could run, roll, leap, and kill with the precision of a craftsman and the endurance of a beast. Armor was not a prison. It was a second skin. A loud, creaking, miraculous second skin, forged to turn a fragile man into something more. The average full suit of plate armor weighed around 20 to 30 kilograms, less than what a modern soldier carries today in gear. But the genius wasn't in its weight. It was in how that weight was distributed. It didn't hang on the shoulders like a burden. It was balanced across the body, resting on the hips, and supported by straps and joints designed to move with the wearer. Try to imagine it, every plate overlapping like the scales of a fish, each one articulated so it could shift with the body's motion. The arms could rise, the knees bend, the torso twist. The knight could mount a horse swing, a weapon, even somersault if he wished. Some did because training demanded it, and they trained for hours. Squires learned early how to move inside the metal, how to flow, rather than fight against it. To them, armor wasn't confinement. It was rhythm, a choreography of movement, breath, and balance. You can still see it in surviving suits today. The way the elbow couters flare like petals to allow full extension. The ridges along breastplates that deflect blows instead of resisting them. Every rivet was a thought. Every hinge, a small prayer to mobility. So when you picture a knight trudging slowly into battle, erase it. Replace it with the image of a man running in steel. Not gracefully, perhaps, but powerfully. His steps are heavy, yes, but deliberate. And his pace, once found, is relentless. He doesn't tire easily because he's trained not to. But even the best design couldn't stop the heat. Imagine wearing your own coffin on a midsummer afternoon. The air inside turns thick, humid, and alive. Beneath the gleaming plates, there's padding layers of linen and wool stuffed with tow meant to absorb sweat and soften impacts. It does both too well. The moment you start moving, it begins to soak, trapping heat against your skin. Every breath becomes warmer than the last. The metal itself absorbs the sun, radiating it inward like an oven. Knights fought not only their enemies, but their own temperature. Accounts speak of men fainting during prolonged battles, not from wounds, but from suffocation within their armor. Some carried small leather flasks strapped to their belts, desperate for water between charges. Others learned to open their visors whenever possible, to gulp air to see to live. The visor dilemma was one of the most miserable ironies of knighthood. Lower it, and you were safe but blind, deaf, half suffocating. Raise it, and you could breathe right up until an arrow reminded you why that was a bad idea. It was a choice between awareness and protection, and both killed in their own ways. And yet, despite these torments, knights adapted. They learned to read the battlefield through sound and vibration. The clang of metal on metal told them more than sight could. The direction of the wind through the visor slits gave away movement. They could sense their own weight in motion, every shift of armor plates becoming part of their instinct. Armor was not static. It evolved generation by generation in a centuries-long conversation between death and survival. Each weapon invented a new problem. Armor replied with a new solution. When arrows pierced mail plates arrived. When swords found gaps in those plates, fluted armor deflected them. When maces began to crush, rather than cut, smiths thickened the steel over vital organs. And when poleaxes and warhammers appeared, weapons designed to punch through even the finest breastplate knights reinforced their joints and learned to fight smarter, not harder. It was an arms race, fought in inches. Every improvement in protection invited a new method of destruction. Hammers, spikes, and hooked weapons were born of armor's stubbornness. They didn't need to cut. They only needed to dent, to bend, to crack. A man might survive the strike, yes, but his ribs would not. Still, armor saved lives more often than it took them. The chronicler's silence on small wounds is proof enough. Most soldiers who wore good armor didn't die immediately. They lived long enough for exhaustion heat or bad luck to finish what steel couldn't. In some accounts, knights walked away from battles so bruised they could barely stand but uncut. They removed their helmets and vomited from the heat, only to rise again when called. To wear armor was to live in constant negotiation with discomfort. You learned to ignore the sweat, the pressure of the cuirass on your chest, the rattle of every step. You learned to breathe in rhythm with the metal. Every heartbeat was muffled by layers of iron and cloth, every sound distorted. The world became both louder and smaller, a furnace of echoes. Inside that world, the night was alone. The battlefield became a sea of muffled noise, flashes of color through the narrow visor slit. The sound of your own breathing filled your head. You could feel the heat collecting at the base of your spine, the dampness spreading down your back. And yet, for all this armor worked beautifully, it turned a man into a moving bastion. Swords glanced off, arrows stuck and quivered without penetrating. Even hammers, unless perfectly placed, struggled to do more than stagger their targets. But that invincibility came at a cost time. Battles lasted longer. Killing became harder. A knight in armor could take a dozen hits and still fight. His opponent had to find the small secret vulnerabilities, the armpit, the groin, the neck, the inside of the knee. It turned war into a slower, more deliberate art. Precision mattered more than fury. This endurance changed tactics. Armored combat was not about overwhelming force. It was about patience. Waiting for the stumble, the opening, the mistake. Armor forced men to fight up close, to wrestle, to aim for gaps instead of flesh. The dagger, the warhammer, the poleaxe, all these tools evolved to exploit what armor could not protect. The armorers knew it too. They built suits like puzzles, always trying to hide human frailty behind clever metal. But no matter how perfect the craftsmanship, one truth never changed: the man inside was still human. The weak points were eternal. The eyes, the joints, the places where life needed to move. Even the greatest suit of armor could not protect its wearer from exhaustion. By the end of battle, every knight was drenched, trembling, staggering beneath the very shell that had saved him. The sound of men unclasping their helmets after combat was like a collective sigh of rebirth, steam rising from within the air, thick with sweat and iron. Some fainted as soon as they removed their helmets, the rush of cool air too sudden for their bodies to handle. And then came the bruises. Underneath the armor, the body told its own story. Dark blooms across shoulders and ribs where blunt strikes had landed. Sometimes, when the armor was peeled away, the man inside looked mottled, like a decaying fruit, black and purple and red, but alive. Survival was the armor's truest victory. That's the irony of those romantic paintings, the gleaming knights who look so noble and invulnerable. They were sweating, swearing, half-suffocating men inside those beautiful shells. But they endured because endurance was the only form of immortality available to mortals. In the quiet moments between battles, armor hung from racks glistening in the torchlight, looking almost peaceful. The smiths who made them treated them with reverence because each piece was the record of countless lessons, 1,000 small deaths avoided. They knew the balance between flexibility and fortitude, between protection and breath. To wear armor was to carry both faith and fear. Faith in the craftsman's skill. Fear that somewhere hidden in the steel's perfection, a single gap waited for a spike, an arrow, or a blade to find it. That awareness gave knights their peculiar calm, not arrogance, but resignation. They knew that armor didn't make them immortal. It only bought time. And so they moved through the battlefield, not as invincible giants, but as men who had learned to bargain with mortality, each clang of metal a reminder of how thin that bargain really was. Armor didn't make them less human. It made them more so. It exposed their fragility by encasing it, forced them to feel every drop of heat, every pound of weight, every breath they took. Beneath all that iron was still just flesh, sweating, gasping, surviving. And when the battle was over, when the armor came off, and the night air touched their skin, again, every knight felt it, that lightness, that strange rediscovery of the human form. The metal lay beside them, cooling silent, like the husk of something that had lived and died with them that day. Because armor wasn't just protection, it was companionship. It carried your fear, your exhaustion, your prayers. And when it was gone, you felt naked not from danger, but from the loss of what had shared your suffering. In the end, armor was a paradox, both cage and salvation. It slowed the swing of death, but not its arrival. It gave men courage, but reminded them of their limits. It was the sound of survival itself, the slow, rhythmic music of steel breathing with the man inside. And if you listen closely across the centuries, you can still hear it, that soft metallic echo of movement, the whisper of a visor, lifting the exhale of relief that always followed. The armor did its work. The man lived another day, and somewhere, deep within the clang and the heat, the two became one, the fragile soul and the unyielding shell united by the oldest instinct of all, the will to live no matter how heavy the cost. The fantasy of medieval war has always been too tidy. Painters, poets, and filmmakers prefer it that way. Neat rows of armored men charging across clean fields, banners fluttering swords, clashing like an orchestra of honor. They show us the duel, one knight against another, blades singing, sunlight catching the steel, a clear sky, a sense of purpose, the illusion of control. But real battle was noise and filth and confusion. It was panic wrapped in metal exhaustion disguised as courage. There were no perfect duels, only accidents. The first thing you noticed was the sound. It wasn't the clean ring of swords you imagine. It was a thick, endless roar. Thousands of feet, trampling mud horses screaming arrows, hissing men shouting in a dozen dialects. The clang of metal didn't sing. It rattled and thudded dull and muffled by armor and flesh. Each impact sounded like someone hammering a coffin shut. Commands were lost immediately. Trumpets blared, banners rose, but within minutes of engagement, the line was gone. The glorious line that generals dreamed of. The front folded in, men stumbled over corpses, shields, splintered spears snapped, and suddenly the battlefield became a single writhing organism. You weren't fighting a war anymore. You were fighting the crowd. You didn't see your enemy coming, so much as feel him, a shadow in your peripheral vision, a shove, a blur of motion. You swung at whatever shape seemed hostile, trusting instinct more than strategy. You couldn't tell friend from foe once the dust rose, once the colors dulled beneath mud and blood. Friendly fire wasn't an accident of gunpowder, it was a constant of chaos. Men died by their own side's hands as often as by the enemy's. Every battle was a betrayal of its own plans. Imagine standing shoulder to shoulder in a shield line. The air smells of damp earth and iron. You hear the horns, then impact. The first rank of men slams into you like a wall collapsing. Shields crunch. The line shudders, folds, breaks. Someone behind you pushes forward. Someone beside you falls. You stumble, swing wildly, make contact with something soft. Maybe it's an arm. Maybe it's a horse's flank. You don't know. There's no time to know. And then you're in it. The air is thick with dust and the copper tang of blood. You can't breathe properly inside your helmet. Your vision narrows to the slit before your eyes. Every second feels like a guess where to move, where to block, when to duck. The noise is everywhere, pressing against your skull, making it impossible to think. The ground beneath you shifts constantly, churned mud-broken weapons bodies. A fallen man's leg might snag your ankle, sending you down. You reach for balance, find only emptiness. The moment you fall, the world changes. Down there, under the forest of moving legs, you are no longer a knight. You are prey. Boots trample your back. A shield edge smashes into your ribs. You try to rise, but the weight of others presses down. Someone steps on your hand, your gauntlet bending inward. You taste dirt through the slit of your visor. You thrash, roll, gasp, fight for air. A spear lands beside your head. You push up again, somehow find your knees, and stumble upright, shaking blind alive by accident. That's how most of battle went: accidental survival. No amount of training could prepare you for the sheer disorder. Formations dissolved in minutes. Communication vanished. The men who didn't panic were the ones who learned to make decisions inside chaos. To see patterns in the madness, not because they were calm, but because they'd surrendered to the fact that control was gone. Knights liked to imagine they fought with discipline, but even they were swallowed by the tide. Mounted charges broke apart on impact. Horses reared, screamed, and fell. Riders who stayed upright found themselves trapped in knots of infantry swinging swords that couldn't move freely, slashing at shapes too close to see. A knight could ride into a battle and never find his target. He might spend hours just trying to survive the crush. And then there was the heat. Armor trapped everything breath, sweat, terror. By midday, it felt like fighting inside an oven. The padding beneath the plates soaked through, turning heavy sticky. The visor fogged with condensation. Every motion took effort. The simple act of lifting a sword felt like pushing through water. Heat stroke was as deadly as any weapon. Knights collapsed mid-battle, overcome not by wounds, but by their own biology. Chronicles tell of men found afterward sitting upright in their armor, as if resting dead from exhaustion and suffocation. Water was scarce, air was worse. The stench of blood and waste clung to everything. Men vomited inside their helmets, tore them off, only to expose themselves to arrows. The field was a fever, a living, sweating furnace of motion. And through it all, weapons failed. The sword bent, the mace stuck, the spear broke, the dagger was lost in the mud. You used whatever came to hand, a broken shaft, a discarded helmet, even your fists. Nothing worked on everyone, and no single weapon guaranteed survival. A sword was useless against thick plate. A mace was too slow against a quick opponent. A spear too long once the lines broke. So knights switched constantly from lance to sword, from sword to dagger, from dagger to sheer desperation. Weapons were choices made in seconds. None were permanent. Sometimes the most effective move was just to shove, to ram your shoulder into someone, to unbalance them, to knock them into another. Momentum was a weapon. So was mud. So was fear. Fear ran through every battle, like a quiet river beneath the noise. It was not cowardice. It was awareness. Every man knew, no matter how fine his armor, how noble his birth, that he could die at any moment for no reason at all. One slip, one unlucky arrow, one horse rolling over him, and everything ended. You could see it in the eyes of the survivors after. That hollow stare, not of glory, but of astonishment. As if they couldn't quite believe the world had let them keep existing when so many others hadn't. Medieval chroniclers, bound by the expectations of their age, tried to turn this chaos into poetry. They wrote of bravery, of valor, of divine favor. But the letters of the men who actually fought, the few that survived, tell a different story. They speak of confusion, of comrades lost in the press, of the horror of hearing men scream for help and being unable to move toward them. One knight at Agincourt wrote, "I could not see whom I struck. I struck anyway." That's the honesty of it. War was not a stage play of honor. It was a blindfolded brawl between exhausted men, each hoping to be the one still standing when the dust cleared. The reality of friendly fire was especially grim. Spears thrown from the back ranks hit allies. Arrows rained down on both sides when the wind shifted. Horses slipped on the corpses of their own riders. In the press of bodies, you couldn't swing without hitting something unintended. Sometimes, men fought on the same side, unaware, until one recognized a familiar crest and froze. And when the fighting ended, when the sun went down, the field didn't fall silent right away. It moaned. The wounded called out for hours through the night into the dawn. Some crawled, dragging themselves toward water. Others begged for a dagger's mercy. The air grew thick with flies before the victors even began to count the dead. That's what victory really looked like. Not celebration, just stillness after noise. And yet, despite it all, the confusion, the filth, the randomness, men kept coming back. Not because they loved it, but because it was the only world they knew. They believed in their causes, their lords, their survival. They trusted the armorers, the horses, the prayers whispered before battle. They hoped foolishly that next time might be cleaner. It never was. You could always tell a veteran by how he moved. He never charged first. He never lingered in one place. He fought in bursts, precise, efficient, unromantic. He knew that in chaos, patience was worth more than bravery. He didn't waste strength on duels that didn't exist. The battlefield was a great equalizer. Noble peasant mercenary all vanished beneath the same mud. There was no time for names, no space for speeches. Only motion, only noise. In the end, medieval warfare was not a contest of skill, but of endurance. The men who lived were not always the best fighters, just the luckiest. The fantasy will always linger, shining armor banners, proud swords flashing like mirrors. But the truth will always smell like sweat, and fear like earth and blood, like the inside of a helmet that's been worn too long. No duels, no elegance, just mayhem. And somewhere in that mayhem, in the screams, the crashes, the desperate pushing and pulling, the real story of the Middle Ages unfolds. Humanity struggling to impose meaning on chaos and failing again and again beneath the weight of its own noise. That was the battlefield, not a song, a storm, a place where every sound was the echo of something breaking, sometimes steel, sometimes bone, sometimes faith itself. If you strip away the gold leaf and the poetry, if you quiet the trumpets and roll up the painted banners, what remains of knighthood is not glory. It is survival. Raw, ugly, relentless survival. Beneath every polished suit of armor was a man who sweated, stumbled, bled, and prayed. A man who learned that victory was not about beauty or honor, but about lasting one heartbeat longer than the next fall of the blade. Medieval warfare was not the ballet of precision Hollywood insists upon. It was noise, confusion, breath, and mud. It was slipping on corpses and choking on your own sweat inside a visor that smelled of rust and fear. It was the shock of impact when two human beings, each wearing 30 kilograms of hope and terror, collided like storms. It was exhaustion that crawled into your bones until even raising your arm felt like lifting a cathedral. The knights were not the shining gods of legend. They were problem solvers in hellish circumstances. Every tool they carried, sword, axe, mace, spear, dagger, or shield, was an answer to a single repeating question. How do I survive this next 5 seconds? Their weapons weren't symbols of elegance. They were engineering solutions. The sword, revered and romanticized, was often a last resort, drawn only when everything else failed. It was a sidearm, not a statement. The maces and warhammers were physics lessons in disguise, blunt force, focused to crack what cutting could not. The axes, quick, vicious, efficient, reminded everyone that simplicity kills best. Spears and lances, the true kings of the battlefield, proved that reach was the only real luxury, and the dagger, that cold whisper of inevitability, taught that wars always ended up close. Every knight carried a personal library of violence, not of style, but of solutions. There was no one way to fight, no single truth. Each battle was improvisation under pressure, a frantic dance between exhaustion and instinct. What worked once might fail the next time. Armor changed, terrain changed, enemies changed. A good knight learned adaptability faster than swordsmanship. Even their shields overworked, battered indispensable, were more than defense. They were statements of endurance. They took the punishment so the man didn't have to. They bore the cracks and the stains, the marks of every mistake that didn't end in death. And when they broke, it was a kind of mercy. The myth tells us knights were noble warriors who fought for honor. The truth tells us they were men who fought because they had to. They were not paragons of grace. They were laborers in a factory of chaos, breathing through slits, sweating beneath steel, enduring pain as routine. Honor on the field was a luxury no one could afford. You didn't look for noble duels. You looked for footing. You didn't seek destiny. You sought a patch of ground that wasn't covered in the dead. Glory was not something you chased. It was something poets invented afterward to make sense of the mess. When the fighting started, everything human was stripped away. Training evaporated into instinct. You stopped thinking in terms of technique and started thinking in terms of breathing. Inhale behind the shield. Exhale when you swing. Keep moving. Don't fall. Don't stop. Every knight who lived long enough to become a veteran understood one rule above all: nothing worked on everyone. The battlefield was a testing ground for desperation. Spears kept the enemy at distance until they broke. Maces crushed through plate until they stuck. Swords looked magnificent until they dulled against armor. And when all else failed, there was always the dagger. Always the hands. Always the mud. You can almost imagine it, the aftermath of battle. The silence that comes too quickly, as though the world itself has stopped to breathe again. The sun sliding low, catching on shattered armor and broken lances. The ground steaming where bodies still give off heat. Flies already finding their feast. The survivors stand in that quiet like ghosts. Some hold their helmets under their arms, too exhausted to feel anything. Others stare at nothing. Their faces streaked with grime, their lips cracked, their eyes wide and unfocused. They are alive, but only barely. Their armor clings to them like guilt. No one cheers. There is no music, only the sound of men catching their breath, the creak of cooling metal, and the wet sound of mud beneath boots as they step away from what used to be life. This was the truth knights lived with, that every victory was indistinguishable from survival. There was no clean line between courage and terror. The same hand that swung the sword one day might tremble over a wound the next, and every weapon that once gleamed on the battlefield would by evening be rusted with the same anonymous blood. They fought not for songs, but for seconds. The chivalric codes, the vows, the polished tournaments, those were inventions of peace, ways to dress up the memory of horror in velvet and poetry. Real combat had no patience for courtesy. It smelled of sweat, piss iron, and wet earth. It was made of slipping feet and breaking bones. Knighthood wasn't a title. It was a condition. A fever that consumed men who were willing to carry the weight of armor, to march into the din and chaos knowing full well that the world they entered had no logic except survival. They were athletes in the truest sense, trained not for beauty, but for endurance. Every bruise was a teacher, every scar a page in their education. They didn't move gracefully because they were noble. They moved efficiently because inefficiency killed. They understood something that modern minds forget, that survival itself is an art. To live through the impossible is its own kind of genius. When the myths talk about knights shining in sunlight, they are remembering the wrong light. The real glow came from the sweat that slicked their faces from the sparks when steel struck steel from the embers of sheer will burning behind their exhaustion. They were not made of honor. They were made of fatigue, pain, and refusal. Refusal to die. Refusal to stop. And in that refusal lay their truest heroism. Because for all the weapons and armor and tactics, for all the engineering and craftsmanship, the essence of medieval war was not technology. It was the human spirit refusing to surrender to chaos. Every strike of the hammer against armor, every thrust of a dagger into a visor, every bash of a shield was one more small argument between life and death, and life stubbornly kept arguing back. If you stood on a medieval battlefield, you wouldn't see glory. You'd see confusion. You'd see mud-swallowing boots, knights stumbling over the fallen horses, screaming, and the air thick with heat and dust. But if you listened closely, beneath the roar, you might hear something else, the heartbeat of survival itself. Slow, ragged, unyielding. It beat inside every man who swung until his arm went numb, inside every knight who fell and clawed his way upright again. It beat inside every smith who forged armor that turned aside one more fatal blow. It beat inside the mud, the blood, the exhaustion, because that's what the Middle Ages were at their core, a world determined not to stop breathing. The truth about knights is that they were not dreamers. They were pragmatists. They didn't fight for legend. They fought because not fighting meant dying, and every victory, however small, was just another sunrise they would get to see through the narrow slit of a visor. Their world was one of mud and steel, but also of astonishing resilience. They weren't slow, stupid, or helpless. They were masters of adaptation. They fought standing, kneeling, crawling, wrestling, stabbing, crushing, blocking, bleeding. They used whatever worked, because that was the only rule that mattered. And when the battle ended, when they stripped off the armor and looked at the bruises blooming beneath their skin, they didn't see shame. They saw proof. Proof that they'd outlasted another day. The poets would later call it bravery. The painters would call it nobility. But the truth was simpler. It was survival. The medieval knight was never a shining figure, untouched by war. He was its embodiment. He was the sound of armor grinding over bone, the hiss of sweat hitting hot metal, the slow exhale after a fight he shouldn't have won. He was the face behind the visor, human, exhausted, stubbornly alive. In the end, medieval warfare was not about who fought best. It was about who refused to stop fighting. And that, perhaps, is the most enduring truth of all. That in every age, beneath every myth, beneath the rust and ruin of centuries' survival, has always been the purest form of glory. No shining swords, no perfect duels, just men, mud, and the will to live another day. That's what knighthood really was, not the dream of a golden age, but the heartbeat of endurance echoing through a world made of iron.